The moment my father tore my Christmas card in half, something inside me died. I'd spent hours making that card by hand. Every fold, every word chosen with the desperate hope that maybe this year would be different. Maybe this Christmas they'd finally see me. But when I handed it to him at their doorstep, he didn't even read past the first line. He just looked at me with that familiar disgust and ripped it right down the middle. "What does a poor girl have to celebrate?" he sneered, letting the pieces fall to the floor. My sister laughed from the dining room. My mother looked away, said nothing like always. I walked out into the cold December night without crying. I was done crying for people who never cried for me. What they didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that the poor failure they just humiliated owned a $3 million mansion across town. That I'd built a fortune in silence while they mocked me for years. And that the CEO they had been desperately trying to impress, the one they once threw my sister at like a prize to be won. He was my husband. They had no idea. Not yet. But when I posted those Christmas party photos the next day, my mansion glowing with lights, my husband's arm around my waist, suddenly my phone exploded. Suddenly, they remembered they had an older daughter. Mom's text came first. "Can we come now?" I hit the laugh reaction and said absolutely nothing. What happened next? Let's just say this story has twists you won't see coming and an ending that will leave you speechless. Stay with me. My name is Brianna Walsh. I'm 38 years old, and I built a financial consulting firm from nothing but determination and sleepless nights. But none of that mattered to the people who were supposed to love me first. To my family, I was still the disappointing daughter, the one who never quite measured up, the one they'd rather forget existed. I stood on my parents' porch that Christmas Eve holding a card I'd made by hand, not bought from a store, not ordered online, made. I'd sat at my kitchen table the night before with cardstock and colored pencils, carefully writing words I'd rehearsed 100 times. Words about wanting to try again. Words about hoping this year could be different. The envelope was slightly crooked because my hands had been shaking when I sealed it. The wreath on their door was new, thick with artificial pine and red velvet ribbon. Through the frosted window, I could see the tree glowing in the living room ornaments catching the light. For just a moment, I let myself remember Christmas when I was small, before everything went wrong, back when I still believed my parents loved both their daughters equally. Before I understood that some children are golden and some are invisible. I rang the doorbell. My father answered. He was wearing the cashmere sweater I knew my sister had bought him, probably with money she'd asked him to loan her. His expression when he saw me wasn't cold exactly. It was worse than cold. It was inconvenienced. "Brianna." Not a greeting. Just an identification, like naming an unexpected package left on the doorstep. "Merry Christmas, Dad." I held out the card. "I made this for you and Mom. I was hoping we could talk. It's been so long since we really—" He took the card from my hand, and for one flickering second, I felt hope. He was going to read it. He was going to see how hard I was trying. He opened it. His eyes moved across my careful handwriting, the message about missing them, about wanting to rebuild what we'd lost, about believing it wasn't too late for us to be a real family again. I watched his face for any sign of softening. Instead, his lip curled. "What does a poor girl have to celebrate?" he said. And then, he tore my card in half. The sound was small, just paper separating, but it echoed through my chest like something vital being ripped apart. He let the pieces fall to the porch floor right at my feet and turned back toward the warm house. "Your mother made dinner. I suppose you might as well come in since you're here." I stepped over the torn halves of my hope and followed him inside. The dining room was beautiful, I'll give them that. Crystal glasses, the good china candles flickering in silver holders. My mother emerged from the kitchen carrying a platter, and when she saw me, her smile flickered and died like a match in the wind. "Oh, Brianna, I didn't know you were coming." "I called last week, Mom. I left a message." "Did you?" She set down the platter without meeting my eyes. I must have missed it. She hadn't missed it. I knew she hadn't missed it. But this was the game we played, the polite fiction that my exclusion was accidental rather than intentional. My sister emerged from the living room in a dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Lauren had always been the beautiful one, the successful one, the daughter my parents actually wanted. She was 2 years younger than me, but had somehow always been treated as the elder, wiser, more worthy, more deserving of attention and resources and love. Well, well. Lauren looked me up and down, taking in my simple sweater and wool skirt. Look who decided to grace us with her presence. Did you take the bus, or can you afford gas these days? I didn't answer. I'd learned long ago that engaging only made it worse. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. Every topic somehow curved back toward my failures. My little apartment in that sketchy neighborhood. My job that Lauren dismissed as pushing papers for people who actually make money. My unmarried status, my modest car, my thrift store coat hanging in the hallway. Meanwhile, Lauren held court. Her promotion, her vacation plans, the important people she knew, the parties she attended, the life she was living, that sparkled so much brighter than mine. My mother nodded along to everything Lauren said, her face glowing with pride. My father asked Lauren questions, engaged with her stories, laughed at her jokes. When I tried to mention a project I'd been working on, something I was actually proud of, the table went quiet for exactly 2 seconds before my father turned back to Lauren and asked about her tennis game. I looked down at my plate. The food was beautifully prepared, but I couldn't taste any of it. On my finger, my grandmother's ring caught the candlelight. She'd left it to me when she died, the only person in my family who ever seemed to see me clearly. "You have a fire in you," she used to say, her papery hand squeezing mine. "Don't let them put it out." I touched the ring now, feeling its familiar weight. Grandma had been gone for 15 years, but sometimes I still talked to her in my head. "What am I doing here?" I asked her silently. "Why do I keep coming back?" By the time I left, the temperature had dropped below freezing. I walked to my car alone. No one offered to walk me out. No one said goodbye from the porch. No one watched to make sure I made it safely down the icy steps. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, waiting for the tears to come. They always came after these visits. I'd cry the whole drive home, then spend the next 3 days wondering what was wrong with me, what I could do differently, how I could finally earn the love that seemed to flow so effortlessly toward my sister. But this time, the tears didn't come. I stared at the glowing windows of my parents' house, at the shadows moving inside where my family was probably already laughing about something Lauren said. And for the first time in my 38 years, I didn't feel sad. I felt something else. Something quieter and harder, like a door finally closing. Why do I keep knocking, I thought. Why do I keep begging to be let into a house that was never built for me? I started the car. The heater hummed to life. I pulled away from the curb, slowly watching the house shrink in my rearview mirror until it was just another cluster of Christmas lights in the darkness. I didn't know it then. I couldn't have known. But that Christmas Eve, walking out of my parents' house for what felt like the 1,000th time, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The woman who drove away that night was not the same woman who would walk back into their lives 1 year later. Because this Christmas, the Christmas they refused, would be the last time I ever begged for their love. I just didn't know it yet. The morning after Christmas, I woke before dawn. The apartment was quiet, my husband still sleeping peacefully beside me. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the previous night in my mind. The torn card. My father's sneer. My sister's laughter. My mother's averted eyes. But something was different this morning. The memories didn't crush me the way they usually did. They sat in my chest like cold stones, heavy but no longer sharp. I'd carried these stones for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to set them down. I slipped out of bed, showered, and dressed in the darkness. By 6:30, I was in my car, driving through streets still decorated with Christmas lights. toward a part of the city my family had never seen. The building rose 22 stories above the financial district, all glass and steel and quiet authority. I parked in my reserved spot in the underground garage and took the private elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, the receptionist looked up with a warm smile. "Good morning, Ms. Walsh. I wasn't expecting you today. Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, David. I had some things to review." He nodded without questioning. That was the culture I'd built here. Respect without interrogation. Trust without surveillance. The opposite of everything I'd grown up with. My corner office overlooked the city floor-to-ceiling windows, framing a view that still took my breath away some mornings. I'd chosen this office not for the prestige, but for the reminder. Every time I looked out at those buildings, those streets, that endless sprawl of possibility, I remembered where I'd started. My assistant had left a portfolio on my desk before the holiday break, a summary of our fourth-quarter investments, client acquisitions, and projected growth. I flipped it open and scanned the numbers. 7 figures in new assets under management. Our third consecutive year of double-digit growth. A client list that included names my father would recognize from business magazines he pretended to understand. I touched my grandmother's ring, running my thumb over the worn gold band. She'd been a seamstress, my grandmother. Worked in a factory for 40 years, saved every penny she could, and died with almost nothing in her bank account because she'd given most of it away to people who needed it more. But she'd seen something in me that no one else bothered to look for. "You have a fire in you," she used to say, her eyes sharp despite her age. "A fire they'll never understand. Don't waste it trying to warm people who refuse to come inside." I hadn't understood what she meant when I was young. I thought she was just being poetic the way grandmothers sometimes are. But she'd known. Somehow she'd known exactly what my life would become, exactly what I'd have to fight against. And she'd tried to arm me for it in the only way she could, with words, with belief, with one small gold ring that reminded me I came from someone who thought I was worth something. The path from that little girl to this corner office hadn't been straight. It had been brutal, actually. After college, I'd taken a job as a junior analyst at a firm that paid barely enough to cover rent. My apartment was a studio so small I could stand in the center and touch both walls. I ate rice and beans most nights, not because I was dieting, but because protein was expensive. But I studied. God, how I studied. Every night after work, I read books on finance, investment strategy, market psychology. I took online courses. I watched tutorials. I learned from every mistake, and there were plenty of those. The first investment that nearly wiped out my savings, the business partnership that fell apart, the client who disappeared with 3 months of unpaid invoices. Each failure taught me something. Each setback sharpened my instincts. And slowly, painfully, I began to build something real. The startup came later, a financial consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses grow. I understood small businesses because I'd been one. I understood struggle because I'd lived it. That authenticity resonated with clients who were tired of slick advisors in expensive suits who'd never missed a meal in their lives. The firm grew. Then it flourished. Then it became something I never could have imagined during those rice and beans years, a company with real employees, real impact, real worth. And through it all, I told my family nothing. I remembered the day I'd transferred money to help save their company. 8 years ago, when I first started making real money, I'd read about their struggles in a local business publication. The family business, a manufacturing company my father had inherited from his father, was hemorrhaging cash. Bad decisions, outdated equipment, debts piling up. I could have let them fail. Part of me wanted to. But despite everything, I couldn't watch them drown. So I created an anonymous investment through a shell company, poured in enough money to stabilize them, and waited. I'd told myself they'd somehow know. They'd sense the love behind the rescue. They'd wonder who believed in them enough to save them, and maybe, just maybe, they'd think of me. They didn't. My father bragged to everyone about the brilliant investor who recognized their potential. My mother told her friends about their incredible luck. Lauren credited her own networking skills. Not once did anyone wonder who this mysterious benefactor actually was. Not once did anyone connect it to me. I attended a family dinner shortly after, quietly hoping for warmth. They talked about the investment all evening. They never once asked about my life. That was the night I learned the truth my grandmother had tried to teach me years before. Giving them money wouldn't make them love me. I could pour my entire fortune into their hands, and they would take it without gratitude, without curiosity, without any change in how they treated me. So I chose silence. I chose to be rich where they couldn't see, successful where they'd never look. It wasn't about hiding from shame. It was about freedom. I knew that if my family discovered my wealth, everything would change, but not in the way I'd once dreamed. They wouldn't suddenly respect me as a person. They'd simply orbit me for money the way planets orbit a sun, using me for warmth without ever seeing my light. My phone sat on my desk, notifications piling up from the family group chat. I hadn't opened any of them since leaving my parents' house last night. I didn't need to. I could imagine the contents: Lauren posting photos of her gifts, my mother commenting with heart emojis, my father staying silent but present. A family performing closeness in the only space where they remembered I existed. A strange detail surfaced in my memory as I stared at my phone, something I'd noticed years ago and never investigated. My childhood savings account, the one my parents opened when I was born, had always contained mysterious deposits. $50 here, $100 there, appearing every month around my birthday for as long as I could remember. I'd assumed it was some automatic transfer my parents had set up and forgotten about. But the amounts were irregular, personal, somehow, and my parents had never mentioned it. I filed the thought away. A mystery for another day. My phone buzzed with a new message separate from the group chat. My husband's name appeared on the screen, and despite everything weighing on my mind, I smiled. I opened the text. "Are you ready to let them see who you really are?" I stared at my husband's text for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. "Are you ready to let them see who you really are?" It was a question he'd asked me before in different words at different moments, and every time my answer had been the same. Not yet. I'm not ready. Maybe next year. But something about this morning felt different. Something about last night had cracked open a door I'd kept sealed for decades. I set the phone down without responding and walked to the window of my office. The city sprawled below me, waking up slowly on the day after Christmas. And without meaning to, I found myself traveling backward through time to the night everything began. 18 years ago, I was 20 years old, home from college for the summer, and my parents were throwing one of their famous parties. Not famous for any good reason, famous because my father liked to pretend we were wealthier and more connected than we actually were. He'd invite local business owners, politicians, anyone he thought might elevate his status. And that summer, he'd managed to secure the attendance of the most talked-about young executive in the region. Marcus Chen, 28 years old, founder and CEO of a tech company that everyone predicted would be worth billions within a decade. Handsome, successful, unmarried. My father saw dollar signs and grandchildren. My mother saw social climbing opportunities. And my sister Lauren saw her ticket to a life of luxury without effort. They'd prepared for his arrival like generals preparing for battle. Lauren was dressed in a gown that cost more than my entire semester's textbooks. Her hair was professionally styled, her makeup flawless. She'd been coached on conversation topics: his company's recent acquisition, his alma mater, his known interests in sailing and classical music. I, meanwhile, was handed an apron. "Help in the kitchen," my mother had said without looking at me, "and try not to embarrass us tonight." I didn't argue. I never argued back then. I just tied the apron around my waist and disappeared into the back of the house where I belonged. The kitchen was hot and loud, filled with the catering staff my parents had hired to create the illusion of wealth. I carried trays of appetizers through the crowd, invisible in my plain black dress, watching my sister sparkle under my parents' spotlight. Every time I passed through the living room, I saw her positioned near Marcus Chen, laughing at things that probably weren't funny, touching his arm with practiced casualness. He smiled politely. He nodded at appropriate moments. But even from across the room, even through my invisibility, I could see something in his eyes that no one else seemed to notice. Discomfort. Boredom. The expression of a man who knew exactly what was happening and wanted no part of it. By 10 o'clock, I'd retreated to the kitchen for a break. The catering staff had mostly finished their work and were cleaning up, leaving me alone at the small table in the corner where the family never sat. I'd smuggled in a business magazine, Forbes, I think, with an article about emerging markets that I'd been wanting to read all week. I was so absorbed in the article that I didn't hear him come in. Emerging markets in Southeast Asia. I looked up, startled. Marcus Chen stood in the doorway. His tie loosened his jacket over one arm. He looked different than he had in the living room, less polished, more real. Like he'd taken off a mask along with his tie. "I'm sorry," I said, automatically closing the magazine. "I'll get back to—" "No, please." He held up a hand. "I'm hiding, honestly. Do you mind if I hide here with you?" I should have said no. I should have gone back to carrying trays and being invisible. But something in his voice, the honesty of it, the relief at finding a quiet corner made me stay. "The article's about Vietnam mostly," I said, holding up the magazine. "Their manufacturing sector." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, and we talked. Not about his company's stock price or his famous connections or any of the things my sister had been coached to discuss. We talked about ideas, about what makes businesses actually succeed versus what makes them look successful, about the difference between growth and sustainability, about the mistakes he'd almost made in his first year as CEO and how he'd learned from them. He asked me questions, real questions. What did I think about vertical integration? Had I considered the risks of overexpansion in emerging markets? What would I do differently if I were running a company? No one had ever asked me questions like that. No one had ever assumed I might have answers worth hearing. I don't know how long we talked. An hour, maybe more. The kitchen lights seemed brighter than they had before, the party noise from the living room fading to a distant hum. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Not as the disappointing daughter or the invisible sister, just as a person with thoughts worth considering. Then my mother appeared in the doorway. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, horror, fury. She crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a bruise. "What are you doing?" she hissed in my ear. "Don't embarrass us." She pulled me away from the table, away from Marcus, back toward my proper place in the shadows. I looked back once as she dragged me through the door. He was still sitting there watching me go with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something between frustration and recognition. Like he was seeing me for the first time and being forced to forget me simultaneously. That was the last time I saw him for 12 years. Life continued. I finished college, started my career, built my company from nothing. I thought about that kitchen conversation sometimes late at night when I was studying alone in my tiny apartment. I wondered what had happened to the young CEO who'd hidden from a party to talk about emerging markets. I'd read about his success in business publications. His company had indeed become worth billions, just as everyone predicted. But I never expected our paths to cross again. Then, at a financial conference in Chicago, I walked into a panel discussion on sustainable investment strategies. And there he was, 12 years older, still handsome, sitting on a panel I'd come to observe. Our eyes met across the conference room, and he smiled, not the polished smile I'd seen him give my sister all those years ago. A real smile. A recognition smile. He found me during the networking hour. "Emerging markets in Southeast Asia," he said, as if no time had passed at all. I never got to finish that conversation. We finished it over coffee, then over dinner, then over months of phone calls and visits, and the slow, careful building of something real. He knew about my family. I'd told him everything, every wound, every humiliation. He never pushed me to confront them. He just waited patient and present for me to be ready. We married quietly 3 years ago in a ceremony my family never knew happened. No announcement, no photos on social media, no chance for them to intrude on something that was finally purely mine. The CEO my parents had so desperately wanted for their golden daughter. The prize they'd dressed Lauren up for and shoved me into the kitchen to avoid. He was my husband now, and he was still waiting for me to be ready. I drove home from the office that Christmas morning, with Marcus's question still echoing in my mind. Are you ready to let them see who you really are? The answer had always been no. But as I turned onto the long driveway that led to my house, I felt something shifting inside me like tectonic plates finally moving after years of pressure. The house came into view, and as always, I felt my breath catch slightly at the sight of it. 3 stories of restored Victorian architecture painted in soft gray with white trim, surrounded by 2 acres of manicured gardens. The previous owners had let it fall into disrepair, and I'd spent 2 years bringing it back to life. Every decision had been mine: the color of the shutters, the pattern of the garden paths, the exact shade of the hardwood floors. When the restoration was complete, I'd walked through every room and cried. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming realization that I had built something beautiful, something permanent, something no one could take away from me. The house had cost just over $3 million, including the renovations. I'd paid for it entirely with money I earned before Marcus and I were married. This was important to me in ways I sometimes struggled to articulate. Marcus had his own wealth far more than mine if we were keeping score, which we weren't. But this house was mine. Every brick, every beam, every inch of it represented years of discipline and patience and refusing to give up when giving up would have been so much easier. I parked in the circular driveway and sat for a moment looking at the Christmas lights we'd hung along the roofline the weekend before. Simple white lights, nothing gaudy. Wreaths on each window made from real pine that filled the air with that sharp, clean scent. A single candle glowing in each window, the old-fashioned kind that my grandmother used to love. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon and fresh-baked bread. Marcus had beaten me home and was already in the kitchen wearing the ridiculous apron I'd bought him as a joke, bright red with the words, "Kiss the CEO," printed in white. He looked up when I came in, his face softening in that way that still surprised me after 3 years of marriage. "You went to the office," he said. "Not an accusation, just an observation." I needed to think. He nodded understanding without requiring explanation. That was one of the things I loved most about him, his ability to give me space without making me feel abandoned in it. "The decorators finished the living room," he said. "Want to see?" We walked through the house together, and I found myself touching surfaces as we passed. The banister I'd had custom carved to match the original Victorian design. The fireplace mantel made from reclaimed barnwood. The built-in bookshelves that held first editions I'd collected over the years, each one a small celebration of a business milestone. The living room was transformed for Christmas. A 12-foot tree stood in the corner by the bay window, decorated with ornaments we'd chosen together, some antique, some handmade, none of them matching in that perfect, imperfect way that real homes achieve. Garlands draped the mantel woven with soft white lights. The furniture had been arranged to encourage conversation clusters of comfortable chairs and sofas where people could actually talk to each other. "It's beautiful," I said. "It's home," Marcus replied, and the simple truth of that statement made my throat tight. We spent the afternoon preparing for the party, not the kind of party my parents used to throw, all performance and pretense designed to impress people they secretly resented. This was something different. An intimate gathering of people who actually mattered to us. My college roommate who'd talked me through the worst nights of my early career. The mentor who'd given me my first real chance in the industry. A few colleagues who'd become genuine friends over the years. Maybe 20 people in total coming to share food and wine and the simple pleasure of being together. Marcus helped me arrange the appetizers on the antique serving platters I'd inherited from my grandmother, one of the few things of hers I'd managed to keep. We laughed about the contrast between this party and the ones we'd both endured in our childhoods. His family had been wealthy, but cold, all formal dinners and strategic conversations. Mine had been aspirational and cruel performance masking dysfunction. Neither of us had experienced the kind of warmth we were trying to create now. "You know what I love about this house?" I said, adjusting a candle on the mantel. "Tell me." "It doesn't need to impress anyone. It just needs to be ours." He came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "It is ours. And it's beautiful because you made it that way." I leaned back into him, feeling the solidity of his presence, the safety of being known and loved without conditions. For a moment, I let myself simply exist in that feeling. Later, as the first guests began arriving, I found myself taking photos. Not consciously at first, just capturing moments that felt worth remembering. The tree glowing in the window, the table laden with food, friends laughing in the warm light of the living room, Marcus pouring wine for someone, his face animated with genuine pleasure. It wasn't until the party was winding down that I thought about what to do with the photos. I'd been so careful for so long, keeping my life invisible to my family. No social media posts that revealed too much. No casual mentions of success. A deliberate wall of silence that protected me from their inevitable attempts to diminish or exploit whatever I'd built. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the lingering sting of my father's words. Maybe it was the question Marcus had asked that morning. Or maybe I was simply tired of hiding. I selected 3 photos. Nothing too obvious. Nothing that screamed wealth. Just the tree in the window, the candles on the mantel, a wide shot of the living room filled with happy people. I posted them to my rarely used social media account with a simple caption, "Grateful for this beautiful Christmas with wonderful friends." My privacy settings had always been strict, but I knew certain relatives could see my posts. Extended family members who talked to my parents, cousins who would mention things in passing. A crack in the wall. A small visibility. I wanted to see what would happen when the light got through. After the last guests left, I sat in the quiet living room with my laptop, too wired to sleep. On impulse, I logged into my old savings account, the one from childhood that I'd nearly forgotten existed. The account still held a modest amount untouched for years. But as I scrolled through the transaction history, those mysterious deposits caught my attention again. $50 in January, the month of my birthday. $100 in January of the following year. The pattern repeated, stretching back as far as the record showed. Small amounts, always in my birthday month, always from a source I couldn't identify. 20 years of deposits that I'd never questioned, never investigated, never understood. Who had been putting money into my account all those years? My parents had opened the account, but this didn't feel like something they would do. They'd never been secretive about their favoritism. Why would they hide this small kindness while openly displaying their preference for Lauren in every other way? I stared at the screen, questions multiplying. But the hour was late and my eyes were heavy. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. The mystery of the deposits could wait. I closed the laptop and went upstairs to bed where Marcus was already sleeping. I slipped under the covers beside him, listening to his steady breathing in the darkness. Somewhere out there my photos were being seen, shared, discussed. The ripples were starting. Soon they would become waves. I woke the next morning to the sound of my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Not the gentle ping of a single notification, but the relentless vibration of messages arriving one after another like a swarm of bees trapped in a glass jar. Marcus stirred beside me, groaning softly at the noise. "What time is it?" he mumbled into his pillow. "Early." I picked up the phone and squinted at the screen. The number of notifications made me blink twice to make sure I was seeing correctly. 47 messages, 12 missed calls, and the numbers were still climbing. I sat up slowly, scrolling through the chaos. The family group chat I'd muted years ago had exploded overnight. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade were suddenly messaging me directly. Aunts and uncles who had forgotten my birthday for 15 consecutive years were sending strings of question marks and exclamation points. The messages blurred together in a frenzy of curiosity and thinly veiled demands for explanation. Then I saw my father's text sent at 11:43 the previous night. "Whose house is that?" 4 words. No greeting, no pleasantry, no acknowledgement that just 2 days ago he'd torn my Christmas card in half and called me a poor girl with nothing to celebrate. Just a blunt demand for information, as if I owed him an answer, as if my life was still his business to audit and dismiss. My mother's messages were more numerous but equally revealing. "Brianna, what is this?" followed by "Where are you?" followed by "Is this real?" followed by "Call me immediately." The progression told a story all by itself. Confusion giving way to desperation, the dawning realization that the daughter they'd written off might have become someone they couldn't ignore. I read each message with a strange calm settling over me. I'd seen this pattern before, though never directed at myself. In my work, I'd watched families circle wealthy relatives like vultures around a wounded animal. I'd seen estranged children suddenly rediscover their parents when inheritance became a possibility. I'd observed the way money changed relationships, revealing the rot that had been there all along beneath polite surfaces. Now I was watching it happen in real time with my own family. The same people who'd made me feel worthless for decades were suddenly very interested in the size of my living room and the quality of my Christmas decorations. The transformation would have been funny if it weren't so pathetically predictable. I noticed one conspicuous absence in the flood of messages. Lauren hadn't contacted me at all. No texts demanding explanations. No calls feigning sisterly interest. No comments on my social media posts. Just silence. But I knew my sister well enough to understand that this silence was louder than any words could be. Lauren was calculating. She'd seen the photos, probably screenshot them, zoomed in on every visible detail. She'd be analyzing the architecture, the furnishings, the quality of the light fixtures. She'd be trying to figure out how her loser older sister, the one she'd mocked for years about her little apartment and dead-end life, had somehow ended up in a house that dwarfed anything Lauren herself had ever owned. I could imagine her scrolling through the images again and again, her perfectly manicured nails tapping the screen impatiently. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. Her entire identity was built on being the successful one, the beautiful one, the daughter who got everything while I got nothing. And now here was photographic evidence that I'd gotten something she couldn't claim, real independence built with my own hands, belonging to no one but myself. What story was she constructing to explain this away? Maybe she'd decided the house belonged to someone else, that I was just a guest at a party. Maybe she'd convinced herself the photos were edited, exaggerated, somehow fake. Or maybe, and this was the possibility that interested me most, she was sitting in uncomfortable silence, because for the first time in her life, she couldn't find a narrative that put her on top. Marcus appeared in the bedroom doorway with 2 cups of coffee, his hair still mussed from sleep. He handed me one and settled onto the edge of the bed, nodding toward my phone. "The ripples?" he asked. "More like a tsunami." I showed him the screen, the endless scroll of messages still growing. "My father wants to know whose house this is. My mother is demanding I call her immediately. Every relative I've ever met suddenly remembers I exist." He sipped his coffee, studying my face. "How do you feel?" I considered the question seriously before answering. "Calm," I said finally. "Strangely calm. Like I'm watching a nature documentary about predictable animal behavior." He laughed softly. "That's one way to look at it." "They're not interested in me." I continued, the truth of it crystallizing as I spoke. "They're interested in what I might have, what I might give them, what my success might mean for their status or their bank accounts. It's not about me at all." "No," Marcus agreed. "It never was." Later that day, as the party preparations continued for round 2, a smaller gathering of close friends who hadn't been able to make it the night before, I found myself responding to the family messages. Not with explanations or invitations or the defensive justifications they were clearly hoping to provoke. Just simple reactions. A laugh emoji here, a thumbs up there, acknowledgement without engagement, visibility without vulnerability. My mother sent another demanding text. "Brianna, this is ridiculous, just tell me what's going on." I sent back a single "ha-ha" reaction and set my phone aside. The party that evening was smaller but no less warm than the night before. My mentor arrived with his wife, bringing a bottle of wine from their recent trip to Napa. My college roommate showed up with her new boyfriend, a quiet man who seemed genuinely interested in the books on my shelves. We gathered in the living room that had so disturbed my family's peace, and we talked about things that mattered: careers and dreams, and the small daily victories that make life worth living. Throughout the evening, my phone continued its buzzing symphony. I ignored it completely. Marcus caught my eye across the room at one point and raised his glass slightly in a silent toast. I smiled back, feeling something I rarely allowed myself to feel: pride. Not in my house or my wealth, but in my ability to be present here in this moment with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I had. The wine flowed, laughter filled the rooms. The questions from my family piled up unanswered, unacknowledged, irrelevant. I was no longer performing for people who refused to see me. I was simply living my life, and if they wanted to watch from outside the window, they could watch. The glass between us was my choice, and I felt no obligation to open it. The party wound down around midnight. I walked my last guests to the door, accepted their hugs and holiday wishes, and closed the heavy oak door behind them with a satisfying click. The house was quiet, except for the soft sounds of Marcus cleaning up in the kitchen. I went to help him, and we worked side by side in comfortable silence, loading the dishwasher and wiping down counters. "Another successful evening," he said, handing me a dish towel. "Another evening they weren't invited to," I replied, and we both smiled at the simple satisfaction of that truth. The next morning I woke to pale winter light filtering through the curtains. Marcus was already up, and I could smell coffee brewing downstairs. I stretched lazily, reaching for my phone out of habit rather than urgency. The notification that caught my attention wasn't a message. It was an alert from our security system. I opened the app and checked the camera at the front gate. A car was parked there, had been for at least 20 minutes according to the timestamp. A silver sedan, expensive but not flashy. And standing beside it, staring up at the house with an expression I couldn't quite read from this distance, was my sister. Lauren was here. I stood at the bedroom window watching my sister on the security camera feed. She hadn't pressed the intercom button yet. She was just standing there, arms crossed against the December cold, staring up at the house like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. The sister who'd always had all the answers, who'd always known exactly where she stood in the family hierarchy, now looked utterly lost in my driveway. Marcus appeared beside me, coffee cup in hand. He looked at the screen and raised an eyebrow. "Do you want me to handle it?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. This is mine to deal with." I took my time getting ready, choosing my clothes with more care than usual. Not to impress Lauren. Nothing I wore would impress her in the way she'd want, but to armor myself. Simple cashmere sweater and soft cream, well-fitted dark pants, my grandmother's ring as always. Quiet elegance that didn't try too hard. The kind of understated wealth that Lauren, with her flashy designer labels and desperate need to be seen, had never understood. By the time I walked down to the gate, Lauren had been waiting for nearly 40 minutes. I could see the irritation in her posture, the way she kept checking her phone and shifting her weight from foot to foot. She wasn't used to waiting. She wasn't used to being on the outside of anything. I pressed the intercom button. "Lauren!" Her head snapped up toward the camera. "Brianna, finally. Can we talk? No greeting. No apology for showing up unannounced, no acknowledgement of the years of cruelty or the scene at Christmas dinner just 3 days ago. Just a demand, as if I owed her my time and attention simply because she'd decided she wanted them. I pressed the button to open the gate and watched on the camera as she drove through her silver sedan, looking somehow diminished against the backdrop of my property. I met her at the front door, standing in the threshold, rather than inviting her in immediately. A small power move, perhaps petty, but I'd earned the right to make her wait just a little longer. She got out of the car and walked toward me, and that's when I noticed the details I'd missed on the small security screen. Her coat was last season's Burberry, showing subtle signs of wear at the cuffs. Her shoes, once pristine designer heels, had scuff marks she'd tried to polish away. Her hair was still perfectly styled, her makeup still flawless, but there was something underneath the surface that I'd never seen in my sister before. Something that looked almost like fear. "Nice place," she said, her eyes darting past me into the foyer. I could see her cataloging everything: the original hardwood floors, the antique chandelier, the fresh flowers on the entry table. Assessing, calculating, trying to figure out what it all meant and how she could use it. "Thank you." I stepped aside just enough to let her pass. "Come in." She walked through my house like a prospective buyer, her gaze landing on each expensive detail with barely concealed hunger. The living room where we'd held the party, the dining room with its 12-seat table, the glimpse of the kitchen through the archway, all marble countertops and professional-grade appliances. I watched her watching my life, and I felt something unexpected, not satisfaction exactly, but a strange kind of peace. This house wasn't about her. It never had been. Whatever she thought of it, whatever judgments she was forming, they couldn't touch what this place meant to me. We settled in the sitting room, a smaller space off the main living area that I used for quiet mornings and difficult conversations. I didn't offer her coffee or tea. She didn't seem to expect it. "So," Lauren said, perching on the edge of an armchair as if afraid to commit to actually sitting down, "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here." "I assumed you'd tell me when you were ready." She flinched slightly at my calm. The old Brianna would have filled the silence with nervous chatter, would have offered reassurances and openings for Lauren to take control of the conversation. But I wasn't the old Brianna anymore, and my silence made her uncomfortable in ways my words never had. "The company is in trouble," she said finally. The words came out rushed, as if she'd been holding them back and they'd finally broken through. "Bad trouble. We've made some investments that didn't pan out, and the market shifted faster than Dad anticipated, and now we're looking at a cash flow crisis that could sink everything within 6 months." I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was noting every detail. So the money I'd given them 8 years ago had been squandered just as I'd suspected. They'd taken my anonymous gift and learned nothing from the near disaster that had preceded it. "We've been trying to find investors." Lauren continued, her words tumbling over each other now. "Dad's been reaching out to everyone he knows, but his reputation isn't what it used to be. People have heard things. There's one possibility, though, a CEO of a major tech company. His firm has been doing strategic investments in manufacturing, and we're exactly the kind of acquisition target they'd be interested in. We've been trying to get a meeting for months." She said his name then, my husband's name, Marcus Chen. I felt my face remain perfectly still, a skill I'd honed over years of hiding my success from these very people. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. They were desperately courting my husband for investment, begging for scraps from the very man they'd tried to match with Lauren 18 years ago. The man they'd never known I married. The man sleeping upstairs in our bedroom right now. "I've heard of him," I said mildly. "He's supposed to be very successful." "He's our only real chance." Lauren leaned forward, and I saw her pride finally crack enough to let desperation show through. "If you have any connections, Brianna, any at all. I know things have been difficult between us. But this is about the family. This is about everything Dad built." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell her that everything Dad built had been saved once already by the daughter he despised, and he'd never even known it. But I held my tongue and let her keep talking. "I have to pick up Lily from school at 3. She added, glancing at her watch. "She gets anxious if I'm late." I blinked. "Lily?" "My daughter." Lauren said it casually, as if I should have known, as if anyone had bothered to tell me that my sister had a child. "She's 8. I thought Mom would have mentioned it." Mom hadn't mentioned it. No one had. I had a niece I'd never met whose existence had been kept from me like everything else in this family. One more way to remind me that I wasn't really part of their circle, even in matters as significant as new life. I didn't know, I said quietly. Something flickered across Lauren's face, then something I'd never seen in all our years of antagonism. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something more complicated. Her eyes darted toward the window, then back to me, and for just a moment the mask slipped completely. They expect so much, she said almost to herself. They always expect so much. And if you don't deliver, if you fall short even once. She stopped herself, visibly pulling her armor back into place. Anyway, that's not important. What's important is the company. Can you help or not? But I'd seen it. That flicker of something vulnerable, something trapped. The realization that Lauren wasn't just the golden child basking in favor, she was also a performer, dancing as fast as she could to keep the approval that had always been conditional, always contingent on her continued usefulness. I'll think about it, I said finally. Lauren's face showed frustration, but she was in no position to push. She'd come here asking for help, and I'd given her neither yes nor no. The power dynamic had completely reversed, and we both knew it. I walked her to the door, watched her drive away in her aging luxury car, and stood in the foyer for a long moment after she'd gone. The door to revenge had opened. I could see the path clearly now, the ways I could make them pay for every slight, every cruelty, every torn Christmas card. They needed me now. They needed what I had, and I could choose to let them twist in the wind they'd created. But something else was occupying my thoughts. That flicker in Lauren's eyes. That momentary crack in her perfect facade. The exhaustion beneath the calculation. What if the golden child was just another kind of prisoner? After Lauren left, I couldn't settle. I wandered through the house, straightening things that didn't need straightening, adjusting decorations that were already perfectly placed. Marcus found me in the kitchen, staring out the window at the bare winter garden without really seeing it. "Want to talk about it?" he asked. "Not yet." I turned to face him. "I need to think first. There's something I need to look at." He nodded, understanding, as always, and left me to my process. I climbed the stairs to my study, the room at the back of the house where I did my most private work. The walls were lined with books and files, the desk positioned to catch the afternoon light. This was my sanctuary, the place where I'd made the decisions that built my fortune. And it was the place where I kept the records of a decision I'd never told anyone about. Not even Marcus. I sat down at my computer and navigated through folders I hadn't opened in years. Financial records from 8 years ago. Investment documents. Wire transfer confirmations. The paper trail of a secret I'd buried so deep I sometimes forgot it existed. 8 years ago, I'd been just starting to make real money. My consulting firm was growing. My investments were paying off, and for the first time in my life, I had more than enough. Not wealthy by any standard that would impress my family, but comfortable, secure, able to breathe without counting every penny. That was the year I'd read about my family's company in a regional business publication. The article was dry, full of financial jargon, but the message was clear. Walsh Manufacturing was in serious trouble. Bad investments, declining market share, debts accumulating faster than revenue could cover them. The company my grandfather had built that my father had inherited was months away from collapse. I'd sat with that article for days, reading it over and over, trying to sort through the complicated tangle of emotions it provoked. These were the people who'd made me feel worthless my entire life. They'd dismissed me, mocked me, made it clear I would never be good enough no matter what I achieved. Part of me, a dark part. I wasn't proud of, wanted to watch them fail. Wanted them to experience even a fraction of the helplessness they'd made me feel for decades. But there was another part of me. The part that still remembered my grandfather's hands rough from factory work teaching me to ride a bike in the parking lot behind the warehouse. The part that remembered being 5 years old and believing my parents loved me before I understood the truth. The part that, despite everything, couldn't completely extinguish the hope that someday, somehow they would see me. So I'd done something foolish, something hopeful, something I'd regretted and not regretted in equal measure ever since. I created a shell company, a simple LLC with a generic name that couldn't be traced back to me without serious digging. I funneled money through layers of legitimate transactions, the kind of complex financial maneuvering I'd learned from years in my industry. And then I invested in my family's company, enough to stabilize their debt, enough to give them breathing room, enough to save them from the collapse that was bearing down like a freight train. I told myself they would know, not consciously, not explicitly, but somehow they would sense that someone who loved them was behind this mysterious rescue. They would feel the love I'd poured into that wire transfer, the desperate hope that this might finally be the thing that made them see me. Looking at the records now, I could see exactly how naive I'd been. The transfer dates, the amounts, the carefully constructed anonymity, all of it a monument to my own pathetic longing for acceptance. What happened after the investment was even more painful to remember. My father had bragged about it constantly. At business association meetings, at church, at every social gathering, he could find an audience. He told the story of how he'd attracted a brilliant investor who recognized the company's potential. He spoke about his own business acumen, his ability to network with the right people, his skill at presenting the company's vision in a way that smart money couldn't resist. My mother had her own version of the story. She told her friends about their incredible luck, how the universe had rewarded their hard work and faith. She talked about the elegant dinner parties they'd hosted, implying that their social graces had somehow attracted this benefactor to their door. And Lauren had been the worst of all. She'd claimed credit for the entire thing, telling everyone who would listen that her networking skills and professional connections had brought this investor into their orbit. She'd positioned herself as the savior of the family business, the brilliant daughter whose social capital had rescued them all from disaster. Not once did any of them wonder who this mysterious investor actually was. Not once did they question the coincidence of a rescue arriving precisely when they needed it most. Not once did the thought cross their minds that the daughter they'd dismissed might have been the hand that pulled them from the water. A month after the investment went through, I'd attended a family dinner. I don't know what I expected, gratitude maybe, or at least some shift in how they treated me. I'd sat at their table, quiet as always, listening to them dissect every detail of their good fortune. They analyzed the investment terms, speculated about the investor's identity, congratulated themselves on their survival. The conversation lasted 2 hours. In those 2 hours, not one of them asked how I was doing. Not one of them inquired about my work, my life, my world. I was as invisible as I'd always been, even as the money I'd given them kept the lights on and the creditors at bay. That was the night I finally learned the truth I should have understood years earlier. Giving them money would not make them love me. I could pour my entire fortune into their hands, every penny I'd ever earn, and they would take it without gratitude or curiosity. They would accept my sacrifice and continue to ignore my existence because the problem had never been my lack of generosity. The problem was that they simply didn't see me as worthy of their attention, their respect, their love. Money wasn't the key to their hearts. I'd tested that hypothesis with an experiment they never knew about, and the results were conclusive. I closed the files on my computer and sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. 8 years had passed since that anonymous investment. I'd grown harder in some ways, wiser in others. The hopeful young woman who'd believed love could be purchased with financial rescue was gone, replaced by someone who understood the transactional nature of her family's affections. Now they were in trouble again. The same patterns of mismanagement and poor decisions that had nearly destroyed them before had brought them back to the brink. And once again they were looking for a savior, this time unknowingly courting my own husband for the role. The irony was almost too perfect. They wanted Marcus's money, his connections, his business acumen. They had no idea that he'd been sleeping beside their dismissed daughter for 3 years, that the CEO they were desperate to impress spent his evenings helping me cook dinner and his weekends helping me garden. I thought about Lauren's desperate pitch this morning, her careful dance between pride and pleading. I thought about my father's demanding text messages, my mother's exclamation points, the sudden flood of family attention after years of silence. They wanted to be saved again. They expected someone to swoop in and fix their mistakes, to reward their poor choices with fresh capital to rescue them from consequences they'd earned. 8 years ago, I'd given them exactly that, and they'd taken it without a second thought, without gratitude, without ever wondering if the invisible daughter might be worth seeing. This time would be different. This time nothing would be free. The conference room on the 34th floor was filled with morning light winter sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. I sat at the head of the polished table, flanked by my lawyer on one side and my financial advisor on the other. Both had worked with me for years. Both knew better than to ask unnecessary questions when I was in this particular mood. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," said David Chen, my lawyer, no relation to Marcus, despite the shared surname. He was a precise man in his 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with a reputation for structuring deals that were bulletproof in court. "You want to invest a significant sum in a small manufacturing company, but you want your identity shielded through a holding company structure until you choose to reveal it." "That's correct." "And you want the investment terms to include comprehensive oversight provisions, quarterly performance benchmarks, and control mechanisms that activate if those benchmarks aren't met." "Also correct." David exchanged a glance with Sandra Okonkwo, my financial advisor. Sandra was younger, mid-40s, with a background in private equity that made her invaluable for exactly this kind of transaction. She'd helped me structure investments before, but never one quite like this. "This is all perfectly legal and standard," Sandra said carefully. "Sophisticated investors use holding company structures for privacy all the time. The oversight provisions you're describing are actually quite common in venture capital agreements. Nothing about this would raise red flags in a regulatory sense." "But," I prompted, hearing the unspoken word hanging in the air. "But you're clearly personally invested in this particular company in a way that goes beyond financial returns." Sandra met my eyes directly. The level of detail in these accountability provisions, the specific focus on vendor payments and employee treatment, this feels personal. I just want to make sure you've thought through what you're doing and why. I appreciated her candor. It was why I'd hired her in the first place. "I have thought it through," I said. "More than you know. Can you structure what I'm asking for?" David nodded slowly. "We can. The holding company will be called Westbrook Capital, generic enough to attract no particular attention. All communications with the target company will go through the holding company's registered agents. Your name won't appear on any documents they'll see until you decide otherwise." "And the investment terms?" Sandra pulled out a folder and began walking me through the framework they'd drafted based on my initial instructions. The terms were strict but fair, exactly what I'd asked for. Complete financial transparency with monthly reporting requirements that would show exactly where every dollar went. Quarterly performance targets tied to debt reduction, operational efficiency, and proper treatment of creditors. Structured repayment schedules for vendors who'd been strung along with empty promises. And then there were the control provisions. If the company fails to meet its quarterly benchmarks, David explained, voting control shifts to the investment group, meaning you. You'd have the authority to appoint board members, approve major expenditures, and make operational decisions. If they meet their targets, they retain full control and you remain a silent investor. If they fail, you step in. I studied the documents, reading every clause carefully. Nothing hidden in fine print, nothing predatory or designed to trap them unfairly. These were standard terms that any struggling company would face when accepting outside investment. The only unusual element was my personal stake in the outcome, something my family would never know until I chose to reveal it. "What about the due diligence process?" I asked. "They'll want to know who they're dealing with." "Westbrook Capital has a clean corporate history and verifiable assets," Sandra replied. "When they do their research, they'll find a legitimate investment firm with a track record of strategic acquisitions. There's nothing that would trace back to you personally. As far as they're concerned, they're dealing with an institutional investor who sees potential in manufacturing." I nodded, satisfied. This was exactly what I needed: accountability wrapped in anonymity, consequences delivered through proper legal channels. For the first time in their lives, my family would face real repercussions for mismanagement. Not punishment, not revenge in the petty sense, just natural consequences that they'd somehow avoided for decades. The meeting lasted another 2 hours as we refined the details. By the time I left the office, the structure was in place. Westbrook Capital was ready to approach Walsh Manufacturing with an investment offer they couldn't afford to refuse. That evening, I spread the documents across our dining room table and waited for Marcus to come home. He found me there surrounded by papers and understood immediately that something significant was happening. "The investment?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "It's ready. I just wanted you to see it before I sign." He picked up the documents and began reading, his expression shifting from curiosity to understanding to something more complicated as he worked through the implications. Marcus was brilliant with contracts. He'd built his own empire, partly through his ability to structure deals that protected his interests while appearing generous to the other party. He would see exactly what I was doing here. "These terms are fair," he said finally. "Strict, but fair. Any company in this position would accept them." "I know. The control provisions are significant. If they fail to meet their benchmarks, and based on what your sister told you, they probably will, you'll have the authority to reshape the entire company." "I know that too." He set the papers down and looked at me with those dark eyes that had first seen me in a kitchen 18 years ago. "Once you do this, there's no going back to how things were. The relationship you have with them now, distant, painful, but at least stable in its dysfunction, that will be gone forever. They'll either become better people through this accountability, or they'll hate you for holding them to standards they've never had to meet." I considered his words carefully. He wasn't telling me not to do it. He was making sure I understood the full weight of the choice I was making. "They already hate me," I said quietly. The truth of it settled in my chest like something I'd always known but never said aloud. "They've hated me my whole life in the particular way that families hate the member who doesn't fit. The difference is that now there will be a reason they can point to. Now their hatred will have a justification they can articulate instead of just a vague sense that I'm not worthy of their attention." Marcus reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "I just want you to be prepared for what comes next." I am prepared. I looked down at the documents, at the careful legal language that would soon reshape my family's future. 8 years ago, I saved them because I still believed love could be earned. I gave them everything I had and asked for nothing in return. And you know what? I got nothing. Not even acknowledgement that I existed. I picked up the pen from the table, feeling its weight in my fingers. This time is different. This time I'm not giving them anything for free. This time there are terms and conditions. This time they have to earn it. Not my love, not my approval, just basic accountability for their actions. If they can do that, the company survives. If they can't, there are consequences. I found the signature line on the first document. My hand was steady. "They've never faced consequences in their lives," I continued. "Not for how they treated their employees, not for how they treated their vendors, not for how they treated me. Everything has always been someone else's fault, someone else's problem, someone else's responsibility to fix." I signed my name with a flourish that felt like closing a door. Not anymore. Document after document, I worked through the stack, signing each one with the same steady hand. Marcus watched without interrupting, bearing witness to a moment that had been building for 20 years. When the last signature was complete, I set down the pen and looked at the pile of papers that would soon arrive on my father's desk, bearing the letterhead of a company he'd never heard of, offering salvation he desperately needed. The countdown had begun. The day of the signing, I stayed home. I'd considered attending in person, watching from behind the anonymity of a conference room wall or an adjacent office. David had offered to arrange it, but in the end, I decided against it. There was something more powerful about being absent, about letting the machinery I'd constructed operate without my physical presence. Let them sign their futures over to a faceless corporation. Let them never guess, not for a moment, that the hand behind it all belonged to the daughter they'd thrown away. Instead, I sat in my study with my phone on the desk before me, watching the screen like a surgeon monitoring vital signs during an operation. David had promised to text updates throughout the process. The first message came at 10:15 in the morning. "They've arrived. Your father and sister. Father seems confident. Sister looks nervous." I could picture them walking into that conference room, the one David had described to me, all polished mahogany and leather chairs, designed to intimidate people who weren't accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. My father would have worn his best suit, the one he saved for meetings where he wanted to project success. He would have walked in like he owned the place, because that was always how he walked into rooms. Confidence was his armor, especially when he had nothing to back it up. The next text came 20 minutes later. "Documents presented. Your father is flipping through quickly, not reading carefully. Sister is asking for time to review." My heart beat faster, though I kept my breathing steady. Of course Lauren was asking for time. She was the one who'd actually run the numbers, who understood just how dire the company's position was. She would know that the terms in those documents weren't just formalities, they were lifelines with conditions attached. But my father wouldn't care about conditions. He never had. Rules were for other people, consequences were for people who couldn't talk their way out of trouble, and fine print was for cowards who didn't trust their own judgment. Another text. "Father dismissive of sister's concerns. Quote, these investors always have the same boring terms. Don't overcomplicate things, we need this money now." Unquote. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. There it was, the arrogance that had defined my father my entire life. The unshakable belief that he was smarter than everyone else in the room, that details were beneath his attention, that consequences would never catch up with him. He was signing documents that could reshape his entire company's future, and he couldn't be bothered to read them. The irony wasn't lost on me. These were the people who had dismissed me as incompetent, as unsuccessful, as incapable of understanding the complexities of business and finance. And here was my father signing away strategic control of his company because he was too arrogant to read the terms he was agreeing to. My phone buzzed again. Sister is asking about control provisions, specifically questioning what happens if quarterly targets aren't met. Father interrupted before I could fully answer. Told her to stop making problems. Lauren was trying. I had to give her that. Whatever dysfunction existed between us, she was at least attempting to protect her family's interests by understanding what they were agreeing to. But my father's ego couldn't tolerate his daughter showing more caution than him, couldn't accept that perhaps his approach of bluster and confidence wasn't adequate for every situation. He was silencing the one person who might have protected him from himself. The next text made my pulse jump. Your father is signing. Each document barely glancing at contents, initialing pages without reading them. I imagined his hand moving across the signature lines, his expensive pen scratching out the familiar loops of his name. He probably felt triumphant, relieved. The crisis was over, the money was coming, and he'd navigated another disaster through sheer force of personality. He had no idea that every signature was a thread in a web I'd woven carefully over weeks. Sister signing now, hesitant but compliant. She's reviewed as much as she could in the time available. Father rushed her. Both signatures complete. Both signatures complete. The words seemed to hover on my screen, heavy with implication. My father and sister had just signed documents that gave me oversight of their company. They'd agreed to quarterly targets they didn't understand, control provisions they hadn't examined, accountability measures they'd never faced before. And they'd done it willingly, eagerly desperate for the cash infusion that would save them from their own mistakes. The final text arrived like a closing gavel. Wire transfer initiated. Funds will arrive in company account within 24 hours. Deal is closed. Congratulations. I set the phone down and stared at the wall of my study, letting the reality settle over me. It was done. The family company was saved again, but this time with strings attached that my family couldn't imagine. This time there would be accountability. This time, there would be consequences for mismanagement and empty promises, and the casual cruelty of people who'd never had to answer for their behavior. That evening, after Marcus came home and we'd eaten dinner together, I returned to my study alone. The notification from my bank confirmed that the wire transfer had been processed, the funds successfully moved from my accounts through the layers of corporate structure I'd created. Walsh Manufacturing would receive the money they desperately needed, and I would receive something I'd never had before: power. I pulled up the investment documents on my computer and read through them again, though I knew every clause by heart. The quarterly performance targets, the monthly financial reporting requirements, the vendor payment schedules, the employee treatment provisions, and the control mechanisms that would activate if any of these requirements weren't met. For the first time in my life, I had legal authority over the people who had never granted me any authority at all. I could attend board meetings as a significant shareholder. I could audit their books whenever I chose. I could demand explanations for expenditures and question decisions that affected the company's health. And if they failed to meet their targets, which based on their history they almost certainly would, I could take control of key operational decisions. It wasn't about destroying them. That had never been my goal. Revenge fantasies were satisfying in the abstract, but actually dismantling my family would bring me no peace. What I wanted was simpler and more profound than destruction. I wanted accountability. I wanted them to experience for the first time in their privileged lives the consequences of their own choices. My entire childhood had been shaped by their refusal to acknowledge me, their insistence that I was less than my sister, less than worthy of attention or affection. My entire adult life had been spent proving myself in silence, achieving success they never knew about, saving them from disaster they never thanked me for. Now the dynamic had finally shifted. For the first time ever, I wasn't the one waiting desperately for their approval, hoping they might notice me, praying they might finally see my worth. Now they were the ones whose future depended on meeting standards I had set. They were the ones who would have to justify their decisions to someone who had the power to hold them accountable. They just didn't know it was me. Not yet. I closed my laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden behind my house. Somewhere across the city, my family was probably celebrating their rescue. My father was likely pouring drinks and congratulating himself on his negotiating skills. My mother was probably relieved, planning how to spin this story to her friends. Lauren was probably quiet, still uneasy about terms she hadn't been allowed to fully examine. None of them knew that the savior they were toasting was the daughter they'd rejected. But they would know soon. The confrontation was coming. I could feel it building like pressure before a storm. And when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same. The invitation arrived 3 weeks after the investment closed. My mother called personally, something she hadn't done in years, her voice carrying that particular blend of warmth and calculation I'd learned to recognize as a child. She wanted to arrange a family dinner, she said, at a nice restaurant, to reconnect after too many years apart, to celebrate the holiday season properly as a family. I listened without interrupting, letting her spin out her performance of maternal concern. She mentioned how lovely my Christmas photos had looked, how she'd been meaning to reach out, how family was so important, especially at this time of year. Not once did she acknowledge the Christmas Eve dinner where my father had torn up my card. Not once did she apologize for years of silence and dismissal. The call was entirely forward-looking, as if the past had simply evaporated the moment she decided she wanted something from me. "I'll discuss it with my husband and let you know," I said when she finally paused for breath. There was a moment of silence on the line. She hadn't known about Marcus, I realized. None of them had. My marriage was another piece of my invisible life, another success they'd never bothered to discover. "Your husband," she repeated carefully. "I didn't realize you were married, dear." "There's a lot you don't know about me, Mom." I could almost hear her recalculating, adjusting her mental model of who I was and what I might be worth to them. "Well, of course he's invited too. We'd love to meet him. Shall we say this Saturday? I know a wonderful restaurant downtown." That evening I told Marcus about the invitation. We were in the kitchen together preparing dinner in the easy rhythm we'd developed over 3 years of marriage. He listened without interrupting, chopping vegetables with the precise movements of someone who found cooking meditative. "What do you want to do?" he asked when I'd finished. "I'm not sure. Part of me wants to ignore them completely. Let them keep wondering, keep guessing. It's more than they ever gave me. And the other part..." I considered the question carefully. "The other part wants to see what they do now, when I'm not the underdog anymore, when they can't dismiss me as easily as they used to." Marcus set down his knife and turned to face me. "Then let's go. It's time to see who they really are when they think they need you." I chose my outfit for that dinner with more care than I'd chosen anything in years. Not flashy would be defensive, would suggest I had something to prove. Instead, I selected quiet elegance. A simple black dress that fit perfectly understated jewelry heels that added 3 inches to my height without screaming for attention. My grandmother's ring, as always, on my right hand. The armor of a woman who no longer needed to impress anyone. Marcus wore one of his tailored suits, the kind that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. Together, we looked like what we were: successful people with nothing to prove and no need for validation. The opposite of everything my family had always believed about me. The restaurant my mother had chosen was deliberately upscale white tablecloths and hushed conversations and prices that would have been unthinkable during my rice and beans years. She'd picked it to impress me, I suspected. To show that they still had standards, still belonged in certain rooms. The irony was that Marcus and I had eaten at finer restaurants than this one on ordinary Tuesday evenings. My parents and Lauren were already seated when we arrived. I watched their faces as the hostess led us to the table, watched the flicker of surprise when they saw Marcus, the rapid reassessment as they took in his tailored suit and confident bearing. My mother's eyes widened slightly. My father straightened in his chair. Lauren's expression became carefully neutral, the mask of someone doing calculations she didn't want anyone to see. "Brianna, darling." My mother rose to kiss my cheek, a gesture of affection I couldn't remember her making since I was a child. "You look so healthy. And this must be your husband." "Marcus Chen." He extended his hand politely, and I saw the name register on my father's face, recognition flickering but not quite catching. The CEO they'd been chasing was famously private, rarely photographed, known more for his company's success than for his personal appearances. My father had probably seen the name on investment materials, but never connected it to a face. The dinner that followed was an elaborate performance that would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. My mother complimented everything about me: my dress, my hair, my glow. Phrases she'd never used in 40 years of being my mother now flowed easily, as if we'd always had this kind of relationship. My father, meanwhile, tried a different approach. He asked careful questions about my business ventures and investment strategies, probing for information with the subtlety of a man who'd never had to be subtle about anything. What exactly did I do for work? How did I know about real estate? Did I have any connections in the financial sector? Lauren was the most strategic of all. She steered the conversation repeatedly toward their new anonymous investors, mentioning the recent infusion of capital as if it were casual small talk. "We've been so fortunate," she said smoothly. "A private equity firm approached us with exactly the terms we needed. Do you know anyone in that world? Brianna, private equity, venture capital, that sort of thing?" Every compliment contained a fishing expedition. Every friendly question had a hook hidden in its soft words. I watched them work their angles with the detachment of a scientist, observing lab specimens, answering vaguely, smiling politely, giving them nothing to hold on to. Marcus was magnificent beside me. He said little, letting them fill the silences with their increasingly obvious maneuvering. When my father asked what he did for work, Marcus simply said, "I run a technology company," without elaborating. My family nodded as if this were ordinary, not realizing they were sitting across from the very CEO they'd been desperately trying to court. By dessert, the pretense of casual reunion had worn thin. My mother leaned forward with poorly disguised eagerness. "You know, Brianna, the company could really use someone with your apparent connections. Perhaps you could introduce us to some of your wealthy contacts. We're always looking for strategic partners." I set down my fork deliberately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. "I'll think about it," I said. The same words I'd used with Lauren at my gate. The same non-committal response that gave them nothing but kept the door technically open. I watched frustration flicker across my father's face, quickly suppressed. As we left the restaurant, I walked ahead with Marcus while my parents lingered behind. My father's voice carried in the cold night air he'd never learned to whisper. "She's playing hard to get," he muttered to my mother. "Wants us to grovel before she helps. Typical." He still didn't understand. After 40 years of not seeing me, he still couldn't fathom that I might simply not need anything from him, that I wasn't playing any game at all, that the power dynamic he'd always controlled had shifted so completely that he couldn't even recognize the new landscape. The next morning, I received an email from Westbrook Capital's registered agent. Walsh Manufacturing had requested a formal dinner meeting with their new investors. They wanted to put faces to the corporation that had saved them to establish a personal relationship with their benefactors. They'd suggested a restaurant for the meeting, a specific restaurant, the same upscale venue where 18 years ago they'd thrown a party to match my sister with a young CEO. The same place where they'd sent me to the kitchen to serve drinks and stay invisible. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. Next week, the curtain would finally rise. The night of the meeting, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for a long moment, studying my reflection. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the girl who had served drinks in a kitchen 18 years ago, invisible in her plain black dress, hoping someone might notice her. That girl had been desperate for approval, hungry for a scrap of attention, willing to accept crumbs from people who should have given her the whole feast. The woman in the mirror was different. She wore confidence like a second skin, quiet elegance that didn't need to announce itself. Her posture was straight, her eyes clear, her grandmother's ring catching the light as she adjusted a subtle earring. She had built everything she owned with her own hands. She had saved the people who dismissed her not once but twice without asking for anything in return. And tonight, she was going to let them see exactly who she had become. Marcus appeared behind me in the mirror, adjusting his tie with the practiced ease of a man who'd worn tailored suits his entire adult life. He met my eyes in the reflection. "Ready?" he asked. "I've been ready for 20 years. I just didn't know it until now." The drive to the restaurant was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I watched the city lights blur past the window, remembering the last time I'd entered this particular building. I'd been 20 years old, home from college wearing an apron instead of a designer dress. The restaurant had been rented out for my parents' party, transformed into a stage for their matchmaking theater. I remembered the weight of serving trays in my hands, the ache in my feet from cheap shoes, the way guests looked through me as if I were part of the furniture. My parents had chosen this venue for tonight's meeting because they thought it would impress their investors. They remembered it as an elegant space where they'd once hosted important people. They had no idea it was also the scene of one of my deepest humiliations. But I remembered. I remembered every moment. We arrived precisely on time, not early, which would suggest eagerness, and not late, which would be unprofessional. The hostess led us toward the private dining room my family had reserved. Through the glass doors, I could see them already seated: my father in his best suit, my mother in nervous pearls, my sister in something expensive that she probably couldn't afford anymore. They were watching the entrance, expectantly waiting for the mysterious investors from Westbrook Capital to arrive. They had no idea that the investors were already walking toward them, that the CEO they'd been courting for months was holding my hand. I pushed open the door and stepped into the room. The confusion on their faces was immediate and visible. My father's welcoming smile faltered as he registered that I was entering first, not following behind the important guests they expected. My mother's brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of my presence. Lauren's expression flickered through several emotions: surprise, confusion, a dawning suspicion she couldn't quite name. "Brianna," my father said, his voice uncertain. What are you doing here? We're expecting your investors. Marcus finished smoothly, stepping forward beside me. I know. That's why we're here. He extended his hand to my father with the practiced grace of a man who'd closed 1,000 deals. Marcus Chen, CEO of Chen Technologies, and more relevantly for tonight's meeting, the managing partner of Westbrook Capital, the investment fund that recently provided your company with a significant capital infusion. The name hit my father like a physical blow. I watched the blood drain from his face as recognition finally clicked into place. Marcus Chen, the CEO they'd been desperately trying to court for months, the brilliant young executive they'd once invited to a party in this very restaurant hoping to match him with their beautiful younger daughter. The same man who was now standing beside me, his wedding ring glinting under the chandelier lights. We've actually met before. Marcus continued, his voice pleasant but carrying an edge of something harder underneath. 18 years ago at a party in your home. You were quite eager to introduce me to your younger daughter that evening. You sent Brianna to work in the kitchen. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that falls when the world shifts beneath your feet, and you realize that nothing you believed was true. My mother's hand froze on her wine glass, suspended in mid-reach. My father's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no sound emerged. And Lauren was staring at the white tablecloth as if she could escape into its blankness, her face crumbling as the implications cascaded through her mind. The anonymous investor, I said quietly, finally speaking into that devastating stillness, was me, both times. I let the words land like stones dropping into deep water. 8 years ago, when the company almost collapsed the first time I was the one who saved you. I created a shell company and poured in enough capital to stabilize your debts. I watched you brag about your brilliant investor, about your incredible luck, about your own business acumen. I listened to Lauren take credit for attracting smart money with her networking skills, and not once did any of you wonder who that investor actually was. Not once did you connect it to the daughter you'd dismissed as unsuccessful. My father found his voice, though it came out strangled. Brianna, I don't understand. And now, I continued as if he hadn't spoken, when you signed those documents from Westbrook Capital without reading them carefully, when you committed to performance targets and accountability provisions and control mechanisms you didn't bother to examine, you were signing agreements with me. Again. Lauren looked up finally, her eyes wet with tears she was fighting to contain. I could see memories hitting her one by one like physical blows. Every time she'd mocked my apartment. Every time she'd laughed about my dead-end life. Every Christmas dinner where she'd positioned herself as the successful daughter, while I sat in silence, invisible and diminished. She'd been cruel to the person who'd saved her family's company, twice. The CEO you were so desperate to impress at that party 18 years ago. I gestured to Marcus beside me. He found me in the kitchen that night and we talked about things that actually mattered. We found each other again years later and built a life together. A life you never knew about because you never bothered to ask. My father finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse. Brianna, we didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You never asked about my work. You never wondered how I could afford the life you glimpsed in those Christmas photos. You just assumed I was still the failure you'd always believed me to be, and you started calculating how to access whatever wealth I'd somehow stumbled into. The accusation hung in the air, undeniable, because it was true. I have spent my entire life waiting for you to see me. I said, my voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. Waiting for you to notice that I existed, that I had value, that I was worth your attention. And do you know what I finally learned? That waiting was a waste of time. You were never going to see me. Not because I was invisible, but because you refused to look. Marcus placed his hand on the small of my back, a gesture of support, of solidarity, of love, earned through years of actually seeing each other. But now, I continued, you're going to have to look, because I'm not just your daughter anymore. I'm your investor. I'm the person who holds strategic control over your company, and I have conditions. I reached into my bag and withdrew a folder of documents. Would you like to hear them? The folder felt lighter than it should have given the weight of what it contained. I opened it slowly, deliberately, letting the anticipation build in the silence. My family watched with expressions ranging from defensive anger to naked fear, uncertain what revelations might emerge next. I pulled out the first document and laid it on the white tablecloth between us. A spreadsheet of vendor accounts, names, and amounts, owed dates stretching back months, and in some cases, years. Morrison Office Supplies, I said, pointing to the first entry. A family-owned business that's been providing your company with materials for 15 years. You owe them $47,000. They've been waiting 8 months. The owner had to take out a personal loan to keep her doors open while you promised payment was coming. I laid down another document. Hendricks Manufacturing, $62,000 outstanding for 11 months. They supply your packaging materials. Last month, they had to lay off 3 employees because their cash flow couldn't sustain the gap your unpaid invoices created. Another document joined the growing pile. Chen Industrial Cleaning, no relation to my husband. $19,000. They've cleaned your facilities for a decade. The owner is 73 years old and was counting on your payments to fund his retirement. He's still working because you haven't paid him. My father's face had gone from pale to flush, the defensive anger building behind his eyes. But I wasn't finished. And then there's this. I placed the most damaging document at the center of the table. Employee retirement contributions. Money that was supposed to go into pension funds. Money that was deducted from paychecks with the promise of matching contributions. You borrowed from those funds to cover operational shortfalls. $94,000 that belongs to people who worked for you in good faith. The silence in the private dining room was suffocating. My mother had stopped crying and was staring at the documents with an expression I couldn't quite read, shock perhaps, or the dawning realization that she hadn't known how bad things had become. This is what you did with the money I gave you 8 years ago. I said, my voice steady and clear. You survived the crisis, and instead of learning from it, you continued the same patterns, borrowing from people who couldn't fight back, making promises you never intended to keep, treating vendors and employees like resources to be exploited rather than partners who trusted you. My father finally exploded. Business is complicated, Brianna. You don't understand the pressures we've been under. The market shifted, costs increased. We had to make difficult decisions to keep the company afloat. I met his eyes without flinching. Hurting people who trusted you isn't a difficult decision. It's a choice. You chose to pay yourselves before paying the vendors who kept your business running. You chose to borrow from retirement funds instead of cutting your own expenses. You chose to make promises you knew you couldn't keep, counting on people being too small or too loyal to fight back. That's not fair, isn't it? I cut him off, something I'd never done in 40 years of being his daughter. Tell me, Dad, when was the last time you drove anything other than a luxury car? When did you last skip a country club membership payment to make sure your employees got their retirement contributions? When did you ever make a sacrifice that actually cost you something? He had no answer. We both knew he had no answer. I took a breath, steadying myself for what came next. The anger had served its purpose. Now I needed to be clear, not cruel. Here are my conditions for maintaining this investment and continuing to support the company, I said. They're not negotiable, but they're not designed to punish you either. They're designed to fix what's broken. I pulled out another set of documents, the remediation plan I'd worked on with David and Sandra. First, full repayment to all outstanding vendors within 90 days. The company has the capital now. There's no excuse for continued delays. Second, complete restoration of employee retirement funds within 60 days, plus a penalty payment to compensate for the time the money was improperly held. Third, transparent quarterly financial reporting with outside oversight. An independent accountant will review your books and verify that payments are being made as promised. No more creative bookkeeping, no more hidden borrowing. Fourth, professional management consultation. Someone with actual expertise in manufacturing operations will review your processes and make recommendations. You're free to accept or reject those recommendations, but you have to hear them. My father was shaking his head slowly, his jaw set in that stubborn line I knew so well. My mother was clutching her napkin like a lifeline. Lauren hadn't moved, her eyes still fixed on the documents showing the damage their family had caused. "And one more thing," I said, my voice softening despite my best efforts to remain businesslike. "I need to hear you acknowledge what you did. Not to me as your investor, that's just business. To me as your daughter." The word hung in the air, fragile and heavy at the same time. "I need to know that you understand how you treated me all these years. The favoritism, the dismissal, the way you made me feel invisible in my own family. I'm not asking you to fix it. Some things can't be fixed. I'm not asking you to love me. I stopped hoping for that a long time ago. I'm just asking you to see it, to acknowledge that it happened, to say the words." My mother made a small sound, something between a sob and a gasp. My father's face had gone hard, the defensive walls slamming into place. "So this is blackmail," he said, his voice cold. "You're using your money to humiliate us, to force us to grovel at your feet." I'd expected this. I'd prepared for exactly this response. "No," I said calmly. "This is choice. Yours to make freely. You can refuse everything I've asked for. You can find other investors to buy out my stake if anyone will take it given the company's condition. You can walk away from this table and never speak to me again." I began gathering the documents, placing them back in the folder with the same methodical care I'd used to lay them out. "But if you want my continued help, if you want the capital infusion that's already in your accounts, the time to restructure the support that could actually turn this company around, these are my terms. Pay the people you owe. Treat your employees with basic decency. Accept some accountability for your decisions. And acknowledge that your daughter was worth more than you ever gave her credit for." I closed the folder and stood pushing my chair back from the table. "I'm not asking you to love me, Dad. I'm asking you to be decent, to the vendors who trusted you, to the employees who depend on you. And yes, to me. That's all I'm asking. Basic human decency." My father's face was rigid with fury, and something else, shame perhaps, though he'd never admit it. "This is humiliating," he said through clenched teeth. "You want me to humiliate myself in front of my own family." I picked up my purse, feeling Marcus rise beside me in silent support. "Then I guess we're finished here." I turned and walked toward the door without waiting for a response. My heels clicked against the marble floor in a steady rhythm, each step carrying me further from the table where my family sat in stunned silence. I didn't look back. I didn't pause to see if they would call after me, didn't slow down to give them a chance to reconsider. For 40 years, I had been the one waiting, hoping, adjusting myself to accommodate their indifference. Tonight, I was done waiting. Marcus fell into step beside me, his presence solid and reassuring without being intrusive. He didn't try to speak or offer comfort. He simply walked with me, matching my pace, letting me set the terms of our exit just as I'd set the terms of the conversation we'd left behind. The restaurant's main dining room passed in a blur of white tablecloths and candlelight. Other diners glanced up as we walked by, probably curious about the couple leaving the private room with such purposeful strides. I kept my eyes forward, my spine straight, my expression calm. Whatever storm was raging inside me, they didn't need to see it. The night air hit my face as we pushed through the front doors, cold and clean and startlingly real after the suffocating atmosphere of that private dining room. I stopped on the sidewalk, suddenly uncertain what to do with myself now that the moment I'd been building toward for months had actually happened. Marcus took my hand, squeezed it gently. "Are you okay?" I nodded, though I could feel my hands trembling slightly. Adrenaline, probably. The aftermath of confrontation. "I'm okay. I think I'm okay. You were incredible in there." "I don't feel incredible. I feel like I just detonated a bomb in the middle of my family." "You told the truth. That's not the same thing." We stood there for a moment, the city moving around us in its usual rhythm of traffic and pedestrians and distant sirens. Inside the restaurant, I could imagine the chaos unfolding. My father would be blustering about ingratitude and manipulation, his voice rising with each excuse he manufactured. My mother would be crying and pleading for someone to fix things, to smooth over the rupture, to make everything go back to the uncomfortable equilibrium they'd maintained for decades. And Lauren would be doing calculations, trying to figure out the angles, assessing what this meant for her position and her future. But I wasn't there to witness any of it. I wasn't there to manage their emotions or absorb their anger or apologize for telling truths they didn't want to hear. For the first time in 40 years, I had chosen myself over their approval. I had walked away from my family on my own terms. The realization settled over me slowly, like warmth returning to cold limbs. I had done it. I had actually done it. "Let's go home," I said. The drive back was quiet, both of us processing the evening in our own ways. Marcus kept one hand on my knee, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. By the time we pulled into our driveway, the trembling had stopped, replaced by something calmer and more solid. After Marcus went to bed, I found myself unable to sleep. I climbed the stairs to my study, needing the familiar comfort of my own space. The events of the evening kept replaying in my mind: my father's defensive anger, my mother's tears, Lauren's crumbling facade. Had I done the right thing? Had I been too harsh? Not harsh enough. I pushed the doubts aside and opened my laptop. There was work to do. The email to David was straightforward and professional. Given the breakdown in communication with Walsh Manufacturing's management, I wanted to proceed with the standard protective oversight provisions outlined in our investment agreement. More frequent financial audits, tighter approval requirements for major business decisions, outside review of any expenditure over a certain threshold. Nothing punitive or vengeful, just the protective measures any prudent investor would implement when the relationship with management had become adversarial. The company would still receive the funding it needed to survive. The vendors and employees I'd fought for would still be paid. But every significant decision would now be monitored, every major expense reviewed by professionals who had no emotional stake in protecting my family's pride. This was what they'd chosen when they chose their defensive anger over acknowledgement. This was the consequence of refusing to meet basic conditions for accountability. I sent the email and sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of the decisions settle around me. It was done. The machinery I'd constructed was now in motion, operating on its own logic, following the terms they'd signed without reading carefully. Unable to settle my mind, I wandered to the corner of my study, where I kept my grandmother's jewelry box. The wooden case was old and worn, its brass hinges tarnished with age. Inside, nestled among a few simple pieces of jewelry she'd left me, was a folded piece of paper I'd found years ago, hidden beneath the velvet lining, like a message meant for the future. I unfolded it carefully, though I knew the words by heart. "Your worth isn't measured by their love. It never was." My grandmother's handwriting, shaky with age when she'd written it, but still clear enough to read. She'd known. Somehow, she'd known exactly what I would face, exactly what I would struggle with, exactly what I would need to hear when the moment finally came. She'd hidden this note where only I would find it, a message across time from someone who had seen me clearly when no one else bothered to look. 20 years I'd carried this note, reading it when I needed strength, trying to believe words that felt like beautiful lies. Tonight, for the first time, I believed them completely. My worth wasn't measured by my family's love or approval or acknowledgement. It never had been. My worth was measured by the life I'd built, the people I'd helped, the integrity I'd maintained, even when it would have been easier to become bitter and cruel. I placed the note back in the jewelry box and returned to my laptop. My browser still showed the savings account page I'd been investigating, those mysterious deposits stretching back through my childhood. $50 here, $100 there, appearing like clockwork every birthday month for 2 decades. Who had been putting that money there? And why? The mystery tugged at me, but I closed the browser window. There would be time to investigate later. Right now, I had a company to monitor, a family to hold accountable, and a heart to protect from the inevitable fallout of the choices I'd made tonight. Sleep finally came around 3 in the morning, and with it dreams I wouldn't remember. The weeks that followed were strange and quiet. No calls from my family, no angry emails or pleading messages. Just silence, which I tried not to interpret as either victory or defeat. The oversight provisions went into effect. The auditors began their work. Reports started arriving on my desk with increasing regularity. 3 months passed. Spring was beginning to soften the edges of winter when the first quarterly report arrived from the independent accountants I'd retained. I opened it in my study on a Tuesday morning, expecting perhaps partial compliance, perhaps some progress tempered by resistance. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Not a single target met. Vendor payments still delayed. Employee retirement funds still not restored. The capital infusion I'd provided had been absorbed into operational expenses with no clear accounting for where it had gone. The company wasn't just failing to improve, it was continuing the same patterns that had brought it to the brink of collapse in the first place. My father had learned nothing, changed nothing. He'd taken my money, rejected my conditions, and continued exactly as before, as if consequences were something that happened to other people. I set down the report and stared out the window at the garden beginning to bloom. The control provisions were about to activate. I read the quarterly report 3 times, hoping I'd somehow misunderstood the numbers. But the figures were clear, the failures undeniable. 3 months of opportunity squandered. 3 months of second chances ignored. My father had taken the lifeline I'd thrown him and used it to continue exactly the same behavior that had nearly drowned his company twice before. The vendor payment schedule I'd insisted upon had been largely ignored. Morrison Office Supplies had received a token payment of $5,000 against their $47,000 debt, just enough to keep them from filing a lawsuit, not nearly enough to actually help. Hendricks Manufacturing had received nothing at all. The elderly owner of Chen Industrial Cleaning was still waiting for his $19,000, still working at 73 because my family couldn't be bothered to honor their obligations. The employee retirement funds remained untouched. The money was still missing, borrowed and spent on operational expenses that the report couldn't quite account for. Where had it gone? The auditors had questions. My father had refused to answer them. And the transparency requirements I'd built into the investment agreement had been met with grudging partial compliance, at best, open obstruction at worst. Financial documents arrived late or incomplete. Requests for clarification went unanswered for weeks. The outside accountants reported that accessing basic information required repeated demands and veiled threats. My father was treating the oversight provisions like suggestions rather than contractual obligations. He was betting that I wouldn't actually enforce the consequences we'd agreed upon, that I was still the invisible daughter who would back down when confronted with his anger. He was wrong. I called David that afternoon. "Activate the control provisions," I said. "All of them." The legal machinery moved with the impersonal efficiency I'd built it for. Under the terms of the investment agreement, the agreement my father had signed without reading, and his arrogance and haste failure to meet quarterly benchmarks triggered an automatic shift in board authority. My representatives now had approval power over all major business decisions. No significant expenditure could proceed without their sign-off. No new hires, no large contracts, no strategic changes could happen without review. My father was still technically the CEO. His name was still on the door, but the absolute control he'd wielded for 30 years was suddenly irrevocably limited. Within weeks, the restructuring began. I didn't handle it personally. That would have been too emotional, too entangled with family dynamics that had nothing to do with running a business. Instead, I brought in professionals. Outside consultants with experience turning around struggling manufacturing companies. People who had no history with my family, no stake in protecting anyone's ego, no patience for the dysfunction that had been allowed to fester for decades. They were methodical and thorough. Every department was reviewed. Every process was evaluated. Every expense was examined with fresh eyes that didn't care about tradition or entitlement or the way things had always been done. The findings were damning, but not surprising. The company was riddled with inefficiencies that my father had refused to address because addressing them would have required admitting he'd made mistakes. Outdated equipment that should have been replaced years ago. Redundant positions created for family friends who contributed nothing but collected substantial salaries. Expense accounts that were essentially personal slush funds for my father and his cronies. The company car went first, a luxury sedan that my father drove to project success, leased on the company's dime for no legitimate business purpose. Then the country club membership billed as client entertainment, despite no evidence that any actual clients had ever been entertained there. Then the inflated salaries for the positions that existed only on paper jobs given to the children and nephews of my father's golf buddies as favors that the company couldn't afford. Each cut was painful for someone, but none of them were arbitrary or vindictive. The consultants made decisions based on what the business actually needed, not on what my family wanted or what would make my father comfortable. For the first time in its history, the company was being run like a company rather than a personal fiefdom. And something remarkable began to happen. The employees who had been holding the operation together for years, the floor managers and production supervisors and administrative staff who showed up every day despite inadequate support, finally started receiving the resources they needed. Equipment was repaired. Training was provided. Suggestions that had been ignored for decades were suddenly being heard and implemented. Vendors who had waited months or years for payment finally received schedules they could count on. The consultants worked with each creditor to establish realistic timelines for repayment backed by actual cash flow rather than empty promises. Morrison Office Supplies got a structured plan to recover their $47,000 over 6 months. The elderly owner of Chen Industrial Cleaning received his first real payment in over a year, with a clear path to full repayment. The company wasn't just surviving, it was beginning to function properly for the first time in memory. But for my father, none of this mattered. The operational improvements, the debt reduction, the restored employee morale, all of it was invisible to him, obscured by the one thing he couldn't accept. He was no longer in absolute control. Reports filtered back to me through various channels. My father raged at home according to people who knew people who worked with my family. He called the consultants every name he could think of. He threatened to sue Westbrook Capital for overreach, then learned from his lawyers that the agreement he'd signed was perfectly legal and completely enforceable. He tried to make decisions without board approval, and was informed politely but firmly that those decisions would not be implemented. For a man whose entire identity rested on being obeyed without question, this was a kind of death. He had built his self-image around being the patriarch, the decision-maker, the man whose word was law. Now his word was just another opinion to be considered, and more often than not overruled by people who actually knew what they were doing. I felt no satisfaction in his suffering. That surprised me a little. I'd expected to enjoy watching him experience consequences for the first time in his privileged life. Instead, I felt something closer to exhaustion. Decades of hoping he would see me, followed by years of working to prove myself, followed by months of engineering this moment. And now that it was here, I just felt tired. The local business community began to notice the changes at Walsh Manufacturing. Small towns talk, and the restructuring was too dramatic to go unremarked. Vendors who had been paid after years of waiting told their friends. Employees who finally had functional equipment mentioned it to their families. Word spread that something significant was happening at the company everyone had written off as a lost cause. One afternoon, David forwarded me an email he'd received from a journalist at the regional business publication. "She's asking questions about the turnaround at Walsh Manufacturing." His message read, "Wants to know who's behind Westbrook Capital. Wants to understand how a struggling company suddenly found itself with professional management and a viable restructuring plan. She's going to write this story whether we cooperate or not." I stared at the email for a long moment. Someone was going to tell this story. The only question was whether I'd have any say in how it was told. The article appeared on a Tuesday morning front page of the regional business section. I found it online before my coffee had finished brewing. The headline catching my eye as I scrolled through my morning news feeds. Local manufacturing company stages remarkable turnaround under new investor oversight. I read it standing at my kitchen counter. Mark is still asleep upstairs, the house quiet around me in the early dawn light. The journalist had done her homework. She'd interviewed vendors who'd been waiting years for payment and were now receiving regular checks on a reliable schedule. She'd spoken with employees who described the difference between working under the old management and the new oversight, the functioning equipment, the restored retirement contributions, the sense that someone finally cared whether the company survived or collapsed. She'd obtained financial records showing the debt reduction, the improved cash flow, the systematic addressing of problems that had been ignored for decades. The article was fair, which made it devastating. The reporter didn't sensationalize or editorialize. She simply laid out the facts. A company that had been weeks away from destroying dozens of small businesses that depended on it now restructured under the guidance of an anonymous investment group that demanded accountability. The contrast between old and new was implicit, but unmistakable. Sources described the previous management style in terms that made me wince, even as I recognized their accuracy. Arrogant, one vendor said. They acted like paying their bills was optional, like we should be grateful they did business with us at all. Another described years of broken promises and empty assurances. Every month it was the same story: the check is coming, we just need a little more time. After a while you stop believing anything they say. The new management team, by contrast, received praise for its professionalism and transparency. They called us directly. The owner of Morrison Office Supplies was quoted as saying, explained the situation honestly, laid out a payment plan, and actually followed through. After 2 years of excuses, I almost didn't believe it when the first check arrived. The reporter noted that the identity of the investors behind Westbrook Capital remained private, as was common in private equity transactions. But she praised whoever they were for stepping in before the damage became irreversible. Without this intervention, she wrote, Walsh Manufacturing would likely have filed for bankruptcy within months, leaving a trail of unpaid debts that would have rippled through the local business community for years. I set down my phone and stared out the window at the garden where early spring bulbs were beginning to push through the soil. My father's company, my family's company, was now a case study in corporate turnaround, a cautionary tale about mismanagement and a success story about accountability. And no one knew that the anonymous savior at the center of it all was the daughter they'd dismissed as a failure. The irony was exquisite and bitter and strangely unsatisfying. Over the following weeks, I found myself unexpectedly close to the community conversation about the article. My work brought me into contact with local business owners, many of whom had opinions about the Walsh Manufacturing situation. At a Chamber of Commerce event, I overheard 2 vendors discussing the turnaround over glasses of mediocre wine. Finally, someone's holding them accountable. One of them said, a woman I recognized as the owner of a local logistics company. They owed us money for 2 years and always had excuses. Now we're actually getting paid. I don't know who these new investors are, but God bless them. Her companion nodded vigorously. I heard the old man is furious. Lost control of his own company because he couldn't be bothered to read the contracts he was signing. Serves him right if you ask me. I sipped my wine and said nothing, my face carefully neutral. At church the following Sunday, I attended occasionally more for the community than the religion I noticed my parents in their usual pew. They looked diminished somehow, their posture lacking the confident entitlement they'd always projected. People greeted them politely but briefly, conversations cutting short in ways that suggested everyone had read the article and drawn their own conclusions. After the service, I watched from across the fellowship hall as acquaintances approached my parents with carefully worded compliments about the company's new direction. Each praise was a small knife, a reminder of who was really in charge now. My mother smiled tightly and changed the subject whenever possible. My father stood rigid and silent, his jaw set in that familiar line of suppressed fury. They couldn't reveal that the savior everyone was praising was actually their estranged daughter. To do so would require admitting that the daughter they'd mocked as poor and unsuccessful had become wealthy enough to bail out their failing business. It would mean acknowledging that the child they'd made invisible had achieved more than they ever gave her credit for. The truth would expose not just their misjudgment but their cruelty, decades of dismissal and favoritism laid bare for their entire social circle to see. So they smiled and nodded and accepted compliments about the investors who had stripped their authority while I watched from across the room in comfortable anonymity. I didn't gloat. I didn't approach them or acknowledge the situation publicly. There was no need. The facts spoke for themselves, published in the local paper for everyone they knew to read. Every mention of the company's turnaround was an implicit criticism of the management that had nearly destroyed it. Every praise for the new accountability standards was a condemnation of the old way of doing things. My father, who had spent decades building a reputation as a successful businessman, was watching that reputation get rewritten in real time. The community that had once deferred to his authority now whispered about his failures and praised the anonymous outsiders who had come to fix his mess. The humiliation was public and ongoing, served cold in small doses every time someone mentioned the article or complimented the company's new direction. It was everything I might have dreamed of during my years of invisibility. And yet, watching my parents shrink under the weight of public judgment, I felt no triumph. Only a tired recognition that consequences once set in motion played out on their own timeline, indifferent to anyone's satisfaction. 3 weeks after the article appeared, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a professional voice identified itself as belonging to the Walsh family's personal attorney. "Ms. Walsh, I apologize for the unexpected call. I'm reaching out on behalf of your mother, Margaret Walsh." I felt my spine stiffen. "My mother?" "Yes, she's requested a meeting with you. She asked me to emphasize that this would be just the two of you without your father present. She says the matter is personal." I was silent for a long moment, processing the request. My mother, who had stood by silently for 40 years while my father and sister diminished me. My mother, who had looked away at every Christmas dinner, who had never defended me, who had chosen the path of least resistance over the protection of her own child. My mother, who apparently had something personal she wanted to say. "When does she want to meet?" I asked. "Whenever is convenient for you, Ms. Walsh. She said she would accommodate your schedule entirely." I thought about the mysterious deposits in my childhood savings account still unexplained. I thought about the crack in my sister's armor, the flicker of something vulnerable I'd glimpsed at my front gate. I thought about the layers of dysfunction in my family, the secrets and silences that had shaped all of us in ways we probably didn't fully understand. "Tell her I'll meet her," I said finally. "This Saturday. I'll text her a location." I ended the call and stared at my phone, wondering what my mother could possibly want to say after 40 years of saying nothing. The cafe my mother chose was small and quiet, tucked away on a side street where neither of us was likely to encounter anyone we knew. She was already seated when I arrived, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had probably gone cold while she waited. She looked older than I remembered, not just aged, but diminished, as if the past few months had drained something essential from her. I sat across from her without ordering anything. The silence between us stretched for a long moment before she finally spoke. "Can you give us a way back from this?" Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the social performance she usually maintained. "I know your father made mistakes. I know we both did. But this is destroying him, Brianna. The company was his whole identity. Watching strangers take control of it, he doesn't know who he is anymore." I listened without interrupting, my face carefully neutral. "He won't apologize," she continued, her eyes pleading. "His pride won't let him. He's stubborn and wrong, and I've told him so, but he can't bend. He never could." She reached across the table as if to take my hand, then stopped herself. "But I'm asking you, mother to daughter, please. There has to be some way to fix this." There was something desperate in her voice, something that might have been genuine. but I'd heard versions of this plea before urgent requests for accommodation that evaporated the moment the pressure lifted. I'd spent my childhood watching my mother choose peace over protection, silence over defense, my father's comfort over my well-being. "The terms haven't changed, Mom," I said quietly. "Pay the people you owe. Treat employees fairly. Accept accountability for decisions. And acknowledge what happened. That's all I've ever asked." She closed her eyes, and I saw tears slip down her cheeks. But she didn't argue, and she didn't promise anything she couldn't deliver. We parted with nothing resolved, two women who shared blood, but had never learned to share truth. 4 days later, Lauren appeared at my office. I was between meetings when my assistant buzzed to say my sister was in the lobby asking to see me. I almost refused. The last thing I needed was another performance of family desperation. But something in my assistant's voice gave me pause. "She seems upset, Ms. Walsh. Really upset." I had Lauren sent up. The woman who walked into my office bore little resemblance to the polished sister I'd known my whole life. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes red and swollen, her carefully maintained composure shattered. She closed the door behind her and stood there looking lost in a way I'd never seen her look before. "I don't know how to be anything else," she said, her voice breaking. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, and she collapsed into it like a puppet whose strings had been cut. "They made me compete with you from the time I could walk," she continued, words tumbling out in a rush. "Every comparison, at least you're not like Brianna. Every reward for being the good daughter, the pretty one, the successful one. I didn't choose it, Brianna. I just survived it. I did what I had to do to keep them looking at me the way they never looked at you." I said nothing, letting her speak. "And now I have Lily." Her voice cracked on her daughter's name. "She's 8 years old and she's so smart and so kind, and I look at her and I think I can't let her grow up the way we did. I can't let her learn that love is something you earn by being better than someone else. I can't let her become what I became." She looked up at me, her eyes raw with something I recognized as genuine despair. "I don't want her in that house," she whispered. "I don't want her learning that cruelty is just how families work." It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. For the first time, I glimpsed not a rival or a villain, but a woman who'd been shaped by the same dysfunction that had shaped me, just from a different angle. Throughout all of this, my father said nothing. Not to me directly, no calls, no messages, no requests to meet. His communications came through intermediaries, lawyers relaying his complaints, my mother conveying his accusations, mutual acquaintances reporting his fury. According to these second-hand reports, I was ungrateful. I was destroying the family. I was using money as a weapon against my own blood. But he never reached out himself. He never considered that an apology might cost less than his crumbling pride. I maintained my position. The door was open. The terms hadn't changed, but I wouldn't drag anyone through who wasn't willing to walk on their own feet. 2 weeks after my conversation with Lauren, a letter arrived at the mansion. Handwritten, not typed. The return address was my mother's. I carried it to my study and opened it slowly, not knowing what to expect. Inside were 3 pages of my mother's careful handwriting, shaky in places, as if her hand had trembled while writing. The words I read made me sit down heavily, my breath catching in my throat. I read the letter twice, then a third time, making sure I understood what she was telling me. Then I reached for my phone to call Marcus, because the world I thought I understood had just shifted beneath my feet. The letter was written on simple stationery, plain cream paper, with no monogram or family crest. My mother's handwriting filled the pages, shaky in places, but determined, as if she'd forced herself to keep going despite whatever trembling in her hands or heart. I read the opening lines and felt the ground shift beneath me. "Brianna, I need to tell you something I should have told you decades ago. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I'm asking only that you finally know the truth about what happened when you were young and what I tried in my small and cowardly way to do about it." She wrote about my childhood, about the early years before the favoritism had fully calcified into the family's permanent structure. She described trying to balance my father's obvious preference for Lauren, trying to carve out moments of protection and attention for me. Small rebellions against an unfair system, extra time helping me with homework, quiet words of encouragement when no one else was listening, attempts to ensure I knew I was valued even if I wasn't the favored child. But my father had noticed. He gave me an ultimatum, my mother wrote. Stop favoring the difficult one or face the consequences. He threatened divorce. He threatened to take everything, the house, the money, both of you. He had lawyers, Brianna. He had connections. And I had nothing. No career, no savings, no resources of my own. In that era, with no way to support myself, I believed every word he said. I set the letter down for a moment, my hands trembling. Then I picked it up and continued reading. I chose to stay. I told myself I was protecting both of you by keeping the family together. But really, I was protecting myself. I was too afraid to leave, too afraid to fight, too afraid to face the world alone. So I stayed, and I watched him diminish you, and I said nothing. I stood by while your sister was praised and you were ignored. I looked away at every Christmas dinner, every birthday, every moment when I should have defended you. The words blurred slightly, and I realized my eyes were wet. I'm not asking you to understand or forgive me. What I did, what I failed to do, was wrong. I was your mother, and I let you believe you were worthless because I was too afraid to pay the price of telling the truth. That's a failure that can never be made right. But there was more. Near the letter's end, my mother revealed something that made my breath stop entirely. The savings account, she wrote. The deposits every birthday. That was me. I read the sentence 3 times, certain I must be misunderstanding. Money I hid from your father a little at a time, put somewhere he would never think to look. I couldn't give you what you deserved openly. I couldn't stand up and say that you were brilliant and capable and worthy of every opportunity your sister received. But I could take $50 here, $100 there, and put it somewhere safe. Somewhere that was yours alone. 20 years of deposits. 20 years of birthday money appearing in an account I'd barely thought about. I'd assumed it was some automatic transfer my parents had set up and forgotten. I'd never imagined it was my mother secretly, desperately trying to give me something my father couldn't take away. I hoped someday you'd find it and know it was from me. I'm sorry it wasn't more. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. I'm sorry that hiding money in an account was the only way I knew how to say I loved you. The letter's final paragraphs were the most devastating of all. I'm sorry for all of it, Brianna. Not because of the business or the money or what you can do for us now. I'm sorry because you deserved a mother who stood up for you and I was too afraid to be her. You deserved someone who would have taken your father's threats and said, do your worst, I won't let you hurt my daughter. Instead, you got a coward who hid $50 bills and called it love. She ended simply, whatever you decide about the company, about our family, about me, I understand. I just needed you to finally know the truth before it was too late. I sat in my study for a long time after finishing the letter, the pages resting in my lap. The afternoon light shifted through the windows, shadows lengthening across the floor, and still I sat trying to process what I'd learned. It wasn't enough. 20 years of hidden deposits couldn't undo 20 years of public silence. Secret love didn't heal the wounds of visible abandonment. My mother's fear, however real, didn't excuse her failure to protect her child. But it was something. It was a piece of the puzzle I'd never known was missing. It was an explanation, if not an excuse. It was an apology that asked for nothing in return, no forgiveness demanded, no reconciliation required, no strings attached to the confession. For the first time in my life, my mother had given me something without expecting anything back. I didn't know what to do with that. I wasn't sure yet how it changed things, or if it changed things at all. Marcus found me still sitting there when he came home. He read the letter silently, then held me while I cried for the mother I'd needed, and the mother I'd actually had, and for the small, inadequate bridge of birthday deposits that had connected them all along. The next morning, I woke to gray skies and steady rain. When I checked the security camera out of habit, I froze. A figure stood at my front gate, motionless in the downpour. According to the timestamp, he'd been there for over an hour. It was my father. I watched him on the security camera for a long moment. This man who had loomed so large in my childhood, who had shaped my understanding of my own worthlessness with every dismissive glance and cutting word. He looked diminished now, standing in the rain outside my gate. Not the commanding patriarch I'd spent 40 years both fearing and desperately trying to please. Just an old man in a wet coat staring up at a house he'd never been invited to enter. Part of me wanted to leave him there, let him stand in the cold, experiencing a fraction of what it felt like to be locked outside, unwanted and unacknowledged. Let him taste the particular loneliness of waiting for a door that might never open. It would be poetic justice, a small revenge that cost me nothing. But I wasn't interested in small revenges anymore. I pressed the button to open the gate. Through the camera, I watched him startle slightly at the mechanical sound, then begin the long walk up my driveway. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if each one cost him something he wasn't sure he could afford to spend. The confident stride I remembered from my childhood was gone. In its place was the shuffle of a man approaching something he didn't know how to face. Before he reached the front door, my phone buzzed with a text message. Lauren's name appeared on the screen, and when I opened the message, I found a wall of text that had been sent at 3 a.m, a confession clearly written through tears and insomnia. "I need you to know the whole truth," it began. "Mom wasn't the only one trapped. Dad told me constantly that if I wasn't better than you, if I didn't outshine you in everything, I'd end up discarded too. He made it clear that his love was conditional, that approval had to be earned every single day, that the moment I stopped being the perfect daughter, I'd be thrown away like you were." I read on my heart beating strangely in my chest. Every cruel thing I said to you, I was saying because I was terrified of becoming you. The ignored one, the forgotten one, the daughter who didn't matter. I wasn't trying to hurt you, or maybe I was, but only because hurting you proved I was still on the right side of the line. I was trying to survive him, Brianna, the same way you were trying to survive him, just from a different position. The message continued raw and desperate. I know that doesn't excuse anything. I know I was cruel and dismissive, and that I participated in something that damaged you in ways I'm only beginning to understand. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve that, and I know it. I just need you to know that I was drowning too. I'm still drowning, and I look at Lily and I think I can't let her inherit any of this poison. I can't let her grow up believing that love is a competition, that family is a battlefield, that her worth depends on being better than someone else. The doorbell rang. I set down my phone and walked to the front entrance. My father stood on the porch, drenched despite the covered entryway. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his expensive coat dark with rain, his shoulders hunched against a cold that seemed to come from inside rather than out. I'd never seen him look so small. I opened the door but didn't step aside to let him in. Not yet. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer at all. The rain continued falling behind him, a gray curtain separating my world from the one he'd come from. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, stripped of the authoritative confidence I'd known my entire life. "I don't know who I am if I'm not in charge." The words hung in the air between us, strange and unexpected. "I've never been anything else," he continued, his eyes fixed on some point past my shoulder, unable to meet my gaze directly. "My whole life I've been the one who made decisions, the one who knew what was right, the one everyone looked to for answers. And now—" He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "Now," I prompted. "Now strangers are running my company. My wife has secrets I never knew about. My daughters—" His voice broke slightly on the word. "I don't know how to be your father without being right about everything. I never learned how to be wrong and still matter." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability or acknowledgement or any of the things I'd asked for. It was something rawer than that, a confession of limitation, an admission of a flaw he'd never before recognized in himself. The man who'd always had answers was standing on my doorstep admitting he had none. I thought about my mother's letter, her decades of hidden love and visible silence. I thought about Lauren's 3 a.m. confession, the terror that had driven her cruelty. I thought about the complicated truth that people who cause harm are sometimes also people who've been harmed, that villains and victims aren't always separate categories. I stepped aside and let my father walk into my house for the first time. He moved past me slowly, his wet shoes leaving marks on the hardwood floor. I'd chosen myself in the home I'd built without any help from him. He looked around at the evidence of my success, my taste, my life, and said nothing. I closed the door against the rain and turned to face him. What are you willing to actually change? We sat in my living room, a careful distance between us on separate couches. I'd offered him a towel for his wet hair, a cup of coffee to warm his hands. Small courtesies that cost me nothing and committed me to nothing. The mansion's elegance surrounded us, the furniture I'd chosen, the art I'd collected, the space I'd created entirely without his help or blessing. Every object in this room was a testament to the woman I'd become, despite being told I would never amount to anything. My father looked around at it all, and I saw him registering what it meant. The scale of his misjudgment, the depth of his blindness. The daughter he'd dismissed had built something beautiful while he wasn't watching. You asked what I'm willing to change, he said finally, his voice rough. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to be different than I've always been. Then why did you come here? He was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup I'd given him. When he spoke again, the words seemed to cost him physical pain. I was wrong about you. I waited, letting the silence do its work. I was wrong about everything. He continued, each word dragged out reluctantly. I told myself you were less because it was easier than admitting I didn't understand you. You were always so quiet, so watchful. You didn't need my approval the way Lauren did, or at least you didn't show it the same way. And instead of seeing that as strength, I saw it as rejection. I told myself you didn't care about me, so I didn't have to care about you. His hands trembled slightly on the cup. That Christmas card you made. I tore it up because... He stopped, breathed, forced himself to continue. Because your hope made me feel guilty. The fact that you kept trying, kept showing up, kept believing things could be different, it reminded me of everything I wasn't giving you. And I couldn't bear that feeling, so I destroyed the thing that caused it. The confession hung in the air between us, ugly and true. You deserved a father, he said, his voice breaking on the word. A real father who saw you and valued you and told you every day that you mattered. Instead, you got me. A man who just happened to have children, who treated fatherhood like a role he was performing instead of a relationship he was building. I let him finish completely before speaking. He needed to say all of it, and I needed to hear all of it, even the parts that hurt. Then I began to lay out my own account. Do you remember my 12th birthday? I asked. Lauren got a party with 20 of her friends, a professional photographer, a cake shaped like a castle. I got a card with $20 in it, and dinner at a restaurant I didn't choose. You forgot to make a reservation, so we waited an hour for a table, and you complained the entire time about how hungry you were. He didn't look away, though I could see he wanted to. Do you remember when I got accepted to my first choice college, I came home with the letter so excited I could barely breathe? You glanced at it, said, "That's nice," and went back to watching television. Lauren's acceptance letter 6 years earlier had been framed and hung in the hallway for months. I continued calmly, without anger. Every forgotten achievement, every dismissed success, every Christmas I'd arrived hoping this would be the year things were different, only to leave feeling more invisible than before. I wasn't asking him to fix any of it. Fixing was impossible. The past was immutable. I was asking him to see it. to acknowledge that it happened, that it was wrong, that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated the 1,000 small cruelties that had shaped my understanding of my own worth. When I finished, the room was very quiet. My father was crying, not sobbing, just silent tears tracking down weathered cheeks. The tears of a man who hadn't cried in decades and no longer remembered how. "I see it," he said finally. "I see all of it now. Everything you described, everything I did and didn't do. I can't pretend anymore that it was normal or acceptable or just how families are. It was wrong. I was wrong." He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture that seemed almost childlike. "I can't undo it," he continued. "I don't know how to make it right. Even if I spent the rest of my life trying, I couldn't give you back the childhood you deserved." I nodded slowly. "No, you can't undo it. But you can choose to be different going forward. That's all any of us can do." I didn't embrace him. I didn't tell him everything was forgiven and forgotten. It wasn't, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Some wounds don't heal completely. Some trust once broken is rebuilt slowly or not at all. But something had shifted in that room. Something had been witnessed that had been invisible for 40 years. My father had finally seen me not as the disappointing daughter or the successful stranger, but as the child he'd failed in specific nameable ways. That seeing didn't erase the failure, but it made it real in a way it had never been before. He left an hour later, walking back down my driveway with a different posture than he'd arrived with. Not defeated exactly. Just different. That evening after Marcus came home and we'd had dinner together, my phone buzzed with a notification from the company monitoring system. A large transfer had just been made to the vendor payment fund, substantial enough to cover nearly all remaining debts. The source of the transfer was my father's personal savings account. 6 months passed, and the world I'd set in motion continued turning on its own axis. The quarterly reports that landed on my desk told a story of transformation. Vendors who'd waited years for payment now received checks on automated schedules, their accounts cleared and their trust slowly rebuilding. Employee retirement funds had been fully restored with penalty payments completed as I'd required. The professional managers I'd brought in had implemented systems that functioned regardless of who was watching, proper accounting, transparent reporting, accountability that didn't depend on my constant oversight. The company wasn't healthy because I was controlling it. It was healthy because it finally had structures that made health possible. My father's transfer from his personal savings had been the turning point, though I hadn't fully recognized it at the time. That act, giving up money he didn't have to give for debts that weren't legally his personal responsibility, had signaled something to the professional managers, to the remaining employees, to everyone watching the situation unfold. The old way was truly over. The man who'd run the company like a personal fiefdom had finally acknowledged that his approach had failed. What surprised me most was how he adapted afterward. I'd expected resistance, sabotage, the slow undermining that wounded pride so often produces. Instead, my father had stepped into an advisory role with something approaching grace. He still came to the office most days, still offered opinions on decisions that required his institutional knowledge, still contributed the decades of experience that no outside consultant could replicate. But he no longer demanded absolute authority. He no longer insisted on being right about everything. He offered his perspective and accepted when others chose differently. It wasn't the transformation of a man into someone unrecognizable. It was more subtle than that, the adjustment of a man who'd finally been forced to see the limits of his own approach and who'd chosen adaptation over extinction. Lauren had found her own unexpected path. She'd thrown herself into community relations work for the company, rebuilding relationships with vendors and small businesses that the old management had damaged. I received reports that she was good at it, genuinely good, not just performing competence. She had a talent for listening, for acknowledging harm without becoming defensive, for making amends that felt authentic rather than calculated. Perhaps she'd always had that talent. Perhaps it had just been buried under the performance of being the favored daughter. My mother, meanwhile, had begun volunteering at a local nonprofit working with families in crisis. It was the first time in her life she'd built an identity outside the family orbit, something that was hers alone, unconnected to her role as wife or mother. When we spoke on the phone, which happened occasionally now, she seemed lighter somehow, less trapped. The papers I signed that Tuesday morning in David's office marked the final step in my planned withdrawal. I was reducing my voting authority to standard investor level, releasing the control provisions that had given me power over major decisions. The company would continue under professional management, with my family contributing in their various new roles without requiring my oversight or approval for every significant choice. It felt like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. "Are you sure about this?" David asked, watching me initial the final page. "You've built something stable here. Walking away now means trusting them to maintain it." "I'm not walking away," I said. "I'm stepping back. There's a difference." I was still an investor. I still had standard shareholder rights. If things began sliding backward, I'd have legal standing to address the situation. But the emergency was over. The intervention had done what it needed to do. Now it was time to let them prove they could sustain what we'd built together. The door between me and my family wasn't locked anymore. The walls I'd constructed for protection had done their job, creating space for accountability and acknowledgement that might never have happened otherwise. But walls weren't meant to be permanent. They were meant to provide safety while healing happened. The door was open now. Not wide open. I wasn't naive enough to pretend that decades of damage could be erased by 6 months of changed behavior. But it was a door with a threshold, one that required intention and respect to cross. My family could choose to walk through it, meeting me in a new space where old patterns weren't welcome. Or they could choose not to. Either way, the choice was theirs. I'd done what I set out to do. I'd created consequences for behavior that had never faced any. I'd forced acknowledgement of harm that had been invisible for 40 years. I'd proved to myself and to them that I could walk away, that my love and involvement weren't guaranteed commodities they could take for granted. Now I was actually walking away, not in defeat or exhaustion, but in completion. The story I'd started wasn't over, stories never really are, but this particular chapter had reached its natural end. 2 weeks before Christmas, a card arrived in the mail. The envelope was addressed in my sister's handwriting, but the return address was different. Lauren's apartment, I realized, not my parents' house. She'd moved out, another change I'd only heard about secondhand. Inside was a simple card, clearly handmade, construction paper and glitter, and the careful effort of someone learning a skill they'd never bothered to develop. But tucked inside the card was something else, a drawing on lined paper done in crayon, with the bright confidence of childhood. A house with a big garden, a sun in the corner, a stick-figure woman with brown hair standing by the door. Underneath, in careful letters that wobbled slightly, "Aunt Brianna, I want to meet you. Lily." My niece, 8 years old, and already reaching across the divide her family had created. I held the drawing for a long time, feeling something bloom in my chest that I hadn't expected. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when my mother came to visit. No crisis driving the encounter, no agenda hidden behind polite words. Just a phone call the day before, hesitant and hopeful. "I was wondering if I could see your home properly, if you'd be willing to show me." I'd said yes before I could overthink it. She arrived at 2 o'clock, parking her modest sedan in the circular driveway, as if uncertain whether she was allowed to be there. I met her at the door and watched her face as she stepped inside, seeing my home through her eyes for the first time. The foyer with its antique chandelier, the living room where I'd confronted my father months ago, the hallway lined with photographs of a life she'd never witnessed. We walked through the rooms together slowly, no rush, no destination. I pointed out things that mattered to me: the reading nook by the window where I spent Sunday mornings, the built-in bookshelves I'd designed myself, the view of the garden from the kitchen where Marcus and I cooked together on weekends. My mother touched surfaces gently as we passed her fingers, trailing across countertops and door frames, as if memorizing physical proof that her older daughter was real and whole and had built something beautiful. "You did all this yourself," she said quietly, standing in my home office. It wasn't a question. I had help, but yes, the vision was mine. She nodded slowly, taking in the degrees on the wall, the awards on the shelf, the evidence of achievements she'd never celebrated because she'd never known about them. "I missed so much," she said. "I missed everything." In the living room, I pulled out the wedding album. It had lived on a shelf for 3 years, opened occasionally when friends visited, but never shared with the family who should have been there when the photos were taken. I set it on the coffee table between us, and we sat on the couch together, closer than we'd been in decades. My mother turned the pages slowly, studying each image with an intensity that bordered on hunger. Me in my simple, elegant dress, nothing flashy, but perfectly fitted. Marcus smiling beside me in a way that showed he meant every word of his vows. The friends who'd gathered to celebrate with us the chosen family I'd built when my birth family wasn't available to fill that role. "You were beautiful," my mother said, her voice breaking on the words. "You were so beautiful, and I wasn't there to see it." I watched her trace the edge of a photograph, me laughing at something Marcus had whispered, my head thrown back in genuine joy. A moment of pure happiness that my mother had missed entirely. "I should have been there," she continued, the tears starting to fall now. "I should have been there for your wedding, for your graduations, for the day you bought this house, for all the ordinary Tuesdays in between. I should have been there for all of it, and I wasn't, and I can never get that time back." There was nothing I could say that would make her absence okay. No words that would erase the decades of distance, the milestones celebrated alone, the achievements accomplished without a mother's witness. But seeing it acknowledged finally, openly, without excuses or deflection, helped in ways I hadn't expected. I started crying too. Not dramatically, not performatively, just quietly releasing grief that had been stored somewhere in my chest for 20 years or more. Grief for the mother-daughter relationship we should have had. Grief for the protection that wasn't given when I needed it most. Grief for the birthdays spent wondering why I wasn't worth a phone call, the holidays, where my absence was apparently unremarkable, the ordinary days that should have included casual conversations and shared meals, and the simple presence of a mother who cared. We sat there together crying, not trying to fix or explain or justify anything, just letting the tears come. When the crying finally subsided, something felt different between us, cleaner somehow. The pretense that everything was fine, that the past could be ignored, that we could simply move forward without acknowledging what had been lost, all of that was gone now. In its place was something more honest, sadder perhaps, but more real. "I can't give you back what I took," my mother said, wiping her eyes with the tissue I'd handed her. "I can't undo any of it." "No," I agreed. "You can't. But I can be here now, if you'll let me. I can try to be the mother I should have been, even if it's 40 years late." I didn't answer immediately. Trust wasn't something that could be restored with a single afternoon of tears, no matter how genuine. But I found myself nodding slowly. "We can try. One day at a time. No guarantees." She nodded back, accepting the conditional nature of what I was offering. It was more than she'd had any right to expect. We sat together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the wedding album still open between us. Then something caught my attention through the window, a car coming up the driveway, familiar but unexpected. I recognized my sister's sedan as it pulled to a stop behind my mother's car. But it wasn't Lauren who captured my attention as the vehicle came into view. It was the small face pressed against the back window, eyes wide with wonder as she took in the mansion for the first time. A little girl with brown hair and her mother's cheekbones staring at my home like it was a castle from a fairy tale. Lily was here. Lily bounded through my front door like she'd been visiting her whole life, her eyes wide with wonder at the high ceilings and elegant furnishings. Lauren followed more cautiously, carrying a bag of her daughter's supplies, with the practiced exhaustion of single motherhood. My parents arrived shortly after my father helping my mother up the porch steps, with a gentleness I'd rarely seen between them. For the first time in my life, my entire family was gathered in a home I owned. I let them settle in the living room, watching Lily explore with the uncomplicated curiosity of an 8-year-old who hadn't yet learned to be impressed or intimidated by wealth. She touched the piano keys, experimentally examined a decorative vase with careful fingers, pressed her nose against the window to study the garden outside. Her wonder was genuine, free of the calculation and assessment I'd seen in her mother's eyes during that first visit to my gate. When everyone was seated, parents on one couch, Lauren on a chair with Lily on her lap, I remained standing. I'd thought about this moment for weeks, rehearsed what I wanted to say, until the words felt natural rather than scripted. "I'm glad you're all here," I began. "This is a first for us being together in my home, and I want it to be the beginning of something better. But before we get comfortable, we need to establish some ground rules for how we move forward." My father's jaw tightened slightly. The instinctive resistance of a man who'd spent his life making rules rather than following them. But he said nothing, waiting. "These aren't punishments," I continued. "They're protections. For everyone, including me. If we're going to rebuild something real, we need to be clear about what that looks like." I'd written the rules down, but I didn't need to read them. They'd been forming in my mind for months, maybe years. First, no insults or dismissive comments. About me. About Marcus, about my choices, about my life. The years of subtle put-downs and obvious favoritism are over. If you can't say something respectful, don't say anything. My mother nodded immediately, almost eagerly. Second, no requests for money or business favors. The investment chapter is closed. I'm a shareholder in the company now, nothing more. My personal resources are not a family emergency fund, and my connections are not networking opportunities for anyone in this room. Lauren's expression flickered, but she nodded. I suspected this rule was harder for her than she wanted to admit. Third, family gatherings will be planned and mutual. No surprise visits, no guilt-based obligations, no ambushes disguised as invitations. If I say I'm not available, that's a complete sentence. It doesn't require justification or negotiation. My father shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. If anyone violates these boundaries, I concluded, I'll step back from contact. Not permanently, I'm not trying to punish anyone, but until the violation is acknowledged and corrected, I'll need distance to protect myself. The room was quiet for a moment. Lily had stopped her exploration and was watching the adults with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read emotional undercurrents. "I'm not trying to control any of you," I said, softening my voice slightly. "I'm telling you what I need to feel safe having you in my life. You can accept these terms or not. That's your choice. But I won't pretend anymore. I won't smile through disrespect or absorb criticism to keep the peace. Those days are over." My father spoke first, his voice gruff but without the defensiveness I'd expected. "Fair enough," he said slowly. "I don't like having rules laid down for me, but I understand why you need them. I'll do my best." It was more than I'd hoped for. Imperfect, conditional, but honest. My mother agreed immediately, relief evident in her posture. "I think clear expectations are exactly what this family needs. We've spent too many years pretending and assuming. At least now we know where we stand." Lauren surprised me most. She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months, maybe years. "Structure," she said. "I actually love having structure. Tell me what the rules are and I can follow them. It's the ambiguity that's always made everything so hard." I hadn't expected that response. It made me wonder how much of Lauren's cruelty over the years had been her own confused attempt to navigate a family with no clear rules, except the unspoken ones that kept shifting beneath her feet. Lily, who had been listening with increasing impatience, finally spoke up. "Does that mean you'll come to my birthday party, Aunt Brianna?" The question was so simple, so direct, so completely unconcerned with the decades of dysfunction that had brought us to this moment. Everyone laughed and the tension in the room dissolved like morning frost. "Yes." I said, finding myself smiling back at this child I was only beginning to know. I'll come to your birthday party. Can I see the garden? She asked, already sliding off her mother's lap. Mom said you have a really big garden. I took her hand, small and warm and trusting, and led her toward the back door. Behind us, I heard my parents and sister beginning a conversation that sounded almost normal, almost like a family. It was awkward and imperfect and nothing like the easy relationships other people seem to have naturally. We'd spent too many years hurting each other for comfort to come quickly. But it was real. And for the first time, it was built on honesty rather than pretense. As Lily exclaimed over the winter roses, I found myself thinking about the calendar. Christmas was approaching again. The anniversary of the night my father had torn up my card and set everything in motion. For the first time ever, I wondered if I might actually want to spend it with my family. December arrived again, marking 1 full year since the Christmas that had changed everything. I was sorting through my mail on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I found a Christmas card in a plain white envelope, my father's handwriting on the address line. I recognized it immediately, that distinctive slant he'd never managed to correct despite decades of signing business documents. My name written carefully as if each letter mattered. I carried the envelope to my study before opening it, wanting privacy for whatever I was about to read. The card itself surprised me. It was handmade construction paper and careful cutting, the work of someone who'd never crafted anything in his life, attempting something unfamiliar. The irony wasn't lost on me. 1 year ago, he'd torn apart a handmade card I'd given him. Now he was sending one to me. Inside, his handwriting covered the blank space in careful, deliberate strokes. I could see where he'd pressed too hard with the pen, where he'd paused to think, where words had been crossed out and rewritten. This wasn't something dashed off casually. It had cost him effort. "Dear Brianna," it began. "I hope this Christmas finds you well. Your mother and I are hosting a small dinner on Christmas Eve, just family, nothing elaborate. You and your husband are welcome if you'd like to join us. No pressure. We understand if you're not ready or if you have other plans. Whatever you decide is fine. We just wanted you to know the door is open. Love, Dad." I read the closing 3 times. Love, Dad. 2 words I couldn't remember ever receiving from him, written or spoken. 2 words that should have been ordinary between a father and daughter, but had always been absent from our vocabulary. The card contained no requests, no manipulation disguised as sentiment, no subtle pressure or guilt designed to compel attendance. It was simply an invitation, genuine, with room to decline, acknowledging that my presence wasn't something they could demand or expect. It was an invitation that understood my right to say no. That was new. That was progress. I showed the card to Marcus that evening, handing it over without explanation and watching his face as he read. When he finished, he looked up at me with a small smile. "Progress," he said. "Progress." I agreed. I didn't respond to the invitation immediately. I let myself sit with it for several days, examining my own reactions. In past years, any communication from my family around the holidays had triggered immediate dread, a tightening in my chest, a mental preparation for disappointment or pain. But this time, reading my father's careful words, I felt something different. Not dread, not even wariness exactly. Just possibility. It felt strange to think about a family holiday without steeling myself for the inevitable hurt. Strange to consider attending a Christmas dinner without mapping out escape routes and defensive strategies. Strange to imagine my father's house as something other than a battlefield. On December 23rd, I sent a simple text to my mother. "We'd love to come. What should I bring?" Her response came within minutes, warm but not overwhelming. "Just yourselves. But if you want to bring something, your grandmother's pie recipe was always my favorite." I'd never made my grandmother's pie. She'd died before she could teach me, and no one in the family had ever offered to share the recipe. But I knew it existed somewhere in my mother's kitchen, written on an index card in my grandmother's shaky handwriting. The fact that my mother remembered it, that she was inviting me to claim that connection to the woman who'd loved me most, It meant more than she probably realized. I spent Christmas Eve morning in my kitchen following the faded recipe card my mother had photographed and sent to me. Marcus helped reading instructions aloud while I measured ingredients, and by noon the pie was cooling on the counter, filling the house with the smell of cinnamon and brown sugar. The drive to my parents' house felt different this time. No knot in my stomach, no rehearsed responses to anticipated criticisms, no mental armor being carefully assembled. Just the ordinary anticipation of a holiday gathering, the pie warm on my lap. Marcus's hand occasionally reaching over to squeeze my knee. I didn't know if this Christmas would be perfect. It probably wouldn't be. Old patterns don't disappear overnight, and my father especially still struggled with his lifelong habits of dismissal. There would likely be awkward moments, perhaps even tense ones. The wounds of 40 years couldn't heal completely in 12 months. But I was choosing to be open to the possibility that things could be different. I was choosing to walk through the door my father had opened, to accept an invitation that asked nothing of me except my presence. That choice all by itself felt like something worth celebrating. Marcus parked the car in front of my parents' house, and I sat for a moment looking at the building that held so many painful memories. The same porch, the same front door, the same wreath, though this year's was simpler than last year's elaborate display. 1 year ago, I'd stood on that porch with a handmade card and a heart full of desperate hope, and my father had torn both apart without a second thought. Now I was standing there again, holding a pie made from my grandmother's recipe, wearing my grandmother's ring, carrying a heart that was no longer desperate, just open. I rang the doorbell. Before the family dinner, there was another celebration. The real one. Our Christmas Eve lunch had become a tradition over the years. Marcus and I had been together, an intimate gathering at our home with the people who'd become family when blood family wasn't available. This year the guest list was larger than usual, the living room filled with faces that represented different chapters of my journey. Sarah arrived first, my college roommate who'd talked me through the worst nights of my early career. She'd been there when I couldn't afford groceries and pretended I was fasting for health reasons. She'd listened to me cry after family holidays that left me feeling worthless. She'd believed in my potential when I couldn't see it myself. Now she was a successful therapist with a practice of her own, and she greeted me with a hug that said everything words couldn't. David Chen followed my first real business mentor, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname. He'd given me my first significant opportunity when I was a junior analyst with more ambition than experience. He'd seen something in me that my own parents had missed, and he'd invested his time and reputation in helping me grow. Now retired, he spent his days gardening and spoiling his grandchildren, but he never missed our Christmas gathering. The guests I was most moved to see were the ones connected to my family's company. 2 former employees who'd been treated poorly for years under my father's management had found new positions through connections I'd helped facilitate during the restructuring. They arrived together both thriving in roles that valued their experience and treated them with dignity. The transformation in their demeanor since the dark days of unpaid retirement contributions and broken promises was remarkable. And then there were the vendors. Margaret Morrison came with her daughter, the 2 of them running the office supply company that had nearly collapsed while waiting for my family to pay its debts. Linda Chen, still no relation to Marcus, had closed her industrial cleaning business and reopened it stronger after finally receiving the money she was owed. Both women had become unexpected friends over the past year, bonded by the strange experience of watching accountability transform a company they'd given up on. The food covered every surface of my dining room dishes brought by guests and prepared with love rather than obligation. Marcus moved through the gathering with easy grace, refilling glasses and drawing out quiet guests and making everyone feel welcome. I watched him from across the room and felt my heart expand with gratitude. Margaret raised her glass as the afternoon reached its peak, her voice carrying across the warm noise of conversation. "I want to make a toast," she announced, and the room gradually quieted. "To Brianna, who didn't just invest money in a struggling company." She paused, her eyes finding mine. "You invested dignity. You made them treat us like people instead of problems to avoid. You gave us back our ability to trust that a handshake actually meant something." I felt tears prick my eyes. I hadn't set out to be anyone's savior. I'd just wanted accountability, consequences, acknowledgement. But the ripples of that simple demand had touched lives I'd never fully know about: small businesses that survived because debts were paid, families that stayed afloat because retirement funds were restored, relationships rebuilt because someone finally insisted on treating people fairly. "I didn't do it alone," I managed to say. "And I didn't do it to save anyone. I just wanted—" "You wanted what we all want," Margaret interrupted gently. "To be treated like we matter. And when you got the power to demand that, you used it to make sure other people got it too? That's not nothing, sweetheart. That's everything." The afternoon continued, full of laughter and shared memories, and the particular warmth that comes from being surrounded by people who genuinely love you. Sarah told embarrassing stories from our college days. David shared wisdom about retirement that made everyone over 50 nod knowingly. The former employees talked about their new positions, their rekindled hope, their plans for the future. Marcus caught my eye across the room at one point and smiled that private smile that was just for me, that said he saw me and loved what he saw. I felt a swell of gratitude so large it almost hurt, a recognition of everything I had, that I'd once believed I would never deserve. I had built a life worth living. I had people who knew me at my lowest and loved me anyway. I had a home filled with warmth and a marriage built on mutual respect, and a career that let me help others while helping myself. Whatever happened tonight at my parents' house, whether it was a step forward or a step back, whether the fragile progress we'd made would hold or crumble, I had this celebration, this chosen family, this proof that I was lovable and worthy and real. Nothing my birth family did or didn't do could take this away from me. By late afternoon, the guests began leaving, hugs exchanged and promises made to gather again soon. Marcus and I cleaned up together in comfortable silence, loading the dishwasher and putting away leftovers, preparing for the second gathering of the day. The drive to my parents' house felt shorter than it should have. Before I was ready, Marcus was pulling up to the curb, parking beneath a streetlight that cast golden shadows across the snow. Through the window, I could see Christmas lights glowing on the porch. Shadowy figures moved behind the curtains, my family preparing for my arrival. Preparing perhaps to try again. I took a deep breath. I stood at my parents' door on Christmas Eve, 1 year after the night that had shattered and remade everything. The same porch, the same wreath, the same doorbell I'd rung 12 months ago with a handmade card and a heart full of desperate hope. But I was not the same woman. Marcus squeezed my hand and I rang the bell. My father opened the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The last time we'd stood in this exact configuration, he'd torn my card in half and let the pieces fall at my feet. Now his eyes held something I'd never seen there before. Uncertainty, yes, but also something softer. Something that might have been hope. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," he said quietly. "We're glad you came." He stepped aside, genuinely welcoming, and I crossed the threshold. I didn't need the armor I used to wear into this house. Not because I trusted them completely. Trust required time and consistency, and we were still in the early chapters of rebuilding. But because I trusted myself now. Whatever happened tonight, whatever old patterns might resurface, I knew who I was. I knew my worth. And that knowledge was armor enough. The evening unfolded imperfectly in small human ways that would have devastated me a year ago, but now just made me smile. My father attempted a joke about technology that landed awkwardly, and instead of using the silence to wound, he simply shrugged and said, "I'm still learning." My mother's roast was slightly overcooked, and she apologized 3 times before Lauren gently told her it was fine. It was delicious. Please stop worrying. Lauren herself spilled wine on the white tablecloth and apologized so profusely that Lily finally tugged on her sleeve and said, "Mommy, it's just a cloth." We all laughed and the tension dissolved. The cruelty was gone. The competition that had defined my childhood, the constant measuring of one daughter against the other, had finally faded. In its place was something messier and more authentic, a family trying to figure out how to be together without the old toxic patterns to guide them. Lily was the brightest presence in the room, running around in her new Christmas dress calling me Aunt Bree, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She showed me her drawings and told me about her school friends, and asked if she could visit my garden in the spring. I said yes to everything. At one point, I caught my mother watching me from across the table. Her expression was one I'd never seen directed at me before, pride unmixed with jealousy or qualification. Just a mother looking at her daughter and feeling proud of who she'd become. Finally. After dinner, I found myself alone in the kitchen loading dishes into the dishwasher. The same kitchen where I'd served drinks 18 years ago, invisible in my plain black dress while my family tried to match my sister with a young CEO. The same kitchen where that CEO had found me reading a business magazine and started a conversation that would eventually lead to everything. I looked around the room and felt nothing. No pain, no anger, no desperate need for approval that would never come. Just peace. I had made my own way. I had built my own life. I had walked through fire and emerged not hardened, but refined. From the living room, I heard laughter, my parents and sister responding to something Lily had said. The sound didn't hurt anymore. It was just family. Imperfect, scarred, trying to be better. Like everyone. The doorbell rang. Lauren went to answer it, and I heard her voice carry back in confusion. "Brianna, there's a little girl here looking for you." I walked to the door, curious. Standing on the porch was a child I didn't recognize, about 10 years old, bundled in a winter coat holding a handmade Christmas card. "My grandma told me to find you," the girl said. "She said you'd know what this means." I took the card. On the front, in careful, childish handwriting, "Thank you for saving my family's store." Inside was a photograph. Margaret Morrison and her daughter and this little girl, 3 generations standing together in front of their office supply business. Alive and thriving because debts were finally paid. Because someone had demanded accountability. Because ripples spread further than we ever know. I looked up from the card, then out at the snowy night. Behind me, my family waited. Before me stood the proof that small acts of justice matter, that choosing integrity over revenge creates something lasting, that power wielded with purpose can heal instead of destroy. I smiled, not the polished smile I used to perform for people who would never love me, but something real and quiet. This was what power looked like when it wasn't about vengeance. It was about choosing who you become. I had chosen well. I thanked the little girl, wished her a Merry Christmas, and watched her run back to her grandmother's car waiting at the curb. Then I closed the door softly and returned to the warmth inside where my family was waiting. A new chapter was beginning, and for the first time I was ready for it. And that's where Brianna's story ends, not with revenge, but with something far more powerful: peace. She spent 40 years trying to earn love from people who refused to see her. She built an empire in silence, saved her family twice without recognition. And when they finally discovered the truth, she didn't destroy them. She gave them something they'd never given her a chance to be better. The father who tore up her Christmas card learned to make one himself. The mother who stayed silent for decades finally found her voice. The sister who competed for survival became an ally instead of an enemy. And little Lily, the next generation, will grow up knowing that family doesn't have to mean cruelty. But the most beautiful part, those ripples of accountability that touched lives Brianna never expected. Small business owners who kept their doors open, employees who got their retirement funds back. A little girl showing up on Christmas Eve with a thank you card, proof that doing the right thing matters even when no one is watching. This story isn't just about revenge or wealth or family drama. It's about knowing your worth when the people who should have seen it refused to look. It's about building a life so complete that their approval becomes optional. It's about choosing who you become no matter where you started. So let me ask you, have you ever felt invisible to the people who should have loved you most? Have you ever wondered if your worth depends on their recognition? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey like Brianna's. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their value isn't measured by anyone else's blindness. Until next time, remember, the best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming someone they can no longer ignore.